Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning into day three of the fifth Dvara Research Conference on House of Finance. I'm Kamesh Shekhar. I work as a communication associate at Dvara Research. I'll be a host for the day. Previously, on day one and day two of the conference, we have discussed and hosted presentations on various themes at the intersection of financial inclusion and household finance research. Today, we'll be hosting a distinguished group of domain experts for talks and panel discussion. Before we start the session, a couple of housekeeping pointers. Panelists, please note that audience are watching this conference on our conference website, where we are live streaming this session. Participants, kindly please drop your questions on the right-hand side chat box. We will post those questions to the speakers during the Q&A session. Also, it would be great if you can add your names when you drop your question. With that, I would like to invite Professor Chinmay Tumbe for our first session on migrants and the COVID-19 pandemic. Professor Tumbe is an assistant professor at the Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. His research has been featured in various distinguished journals, newspapers, and policy portals. Professor Tumbe's research interest includes migration studies, urban economics, and business and economic history. Thank you so much, Professor Tumbe, for joining us today. We look forward to learning from your insights. Over to you.
Thanks for having me over. Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
All right, so I'm going to speak on migration and how the migration crisis that we saw last year, the ongoing crisis for migrant workers in general over the last 1.5 years, and broadly how one might want to think through some of the issues and challenges with it. I'll confess I have very little on financial inclusion per se, but I hope this talk gives you a broader idea on the context in which some of the stuff on financial inclusion needs to be discussed. Essentially, it's going to boil down to how do we think through who are the migrants, how many of them are there, and this constant decision making that migrant workers are now making of whether to stay on or whether to go back, and that has huge repercussions when you eventually think through financing. So hopefully it gives you a broad sense of that. I should also say that unfortunately we don't have good data on migration in the last 1.5 years. Of course, there have been a few localized studies and so on, but it's also tough to really talk with a lot of confidence saying this is exactly what happened. And so a lot of this is also going to be, of course, my work, but also speculation in the sense of what could be happening at the ground level. I'll start off with the presentation which I have, and be happy to take questions. I think after 40 minutes, Kamesh.
45 minutes. Yes.
45 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll probably wrap up. Can you see this?
Yeah.
All right, good. So the context, of course, of talking of this topic right now is that migration is a topic which I, for example, have been working for over 10 years, but it's really come into the policy limelight last year, right? And this happened because we had this terrible migration crisis where we saw literally thousands and thousands of people walking back home, cycling back home after the national lockdown was imposed. Just to give you a kind of background of what was the thinking on migration and policies, until then, because I saw this, fairly closely. For example, this idea of the lockdown itself, and a lot of people said the migration crisis could not have been anticipated, for instance, or the fact that the idea of the lockdown was to buy time to ramp up the healthcare infrastructure, and so this was a sort of collateral damage, unfortunate, but which had to happen instead. I will argue that that's not the case, and just the fact that this year we did not see a migration crisis to the extent we saw last year, should tell us as to what went wrong last year. But it also allows us to kind of pause and think about why migration was not really on the policy radar. In fact, when the government announced the national lockdown, the first thing that came to my mind was what's going to happen with migrant workers. And I wrote an op-ed piece back then. I should say that the government, it's hard to defend the position that the government did not know the migrant workers existed, for the simple reason that there were two reports in 2017 2016-17, both of which I contributed to. One was the economic survey chapter, which pointed out the scale of migration in India, arguing that there are over 100 million migrant workers in India. Right? And this is a large part of this is circular migration. So the numbers were there. Obviously, the numbers on migration are very tricky to get, but by almost any estimate now, they're running in many more than 50 million for sure, and we're seeing more than 100 million based on the estimates we drew in that economic survey chapter. The other one was the working group report on migration, which came out from the Ministry of Labour. I was a member of that group as well. And that basically argued for how to think through migration and so on. So in that sense, this particular government actually had two, decent reports to work with, but yet we got the migration crisis. And the fundamental reason why it happened is that migrant workers are historically been invisible in policy making in India. Invisible through many means, but especially because migrant workers don't have political voice typically in their destinations. So migrant workers typically vote in their source regions. I mean, think of any, Bihar election. They were trying to get migrant workers back from Delhi and, were not to Bihar in order to vote. But those same migrant workers rarely vote in the Delhi elections or the Mumbai municipality elections and so on. As a result, they are kind of invisibilized in the political process. And that's the bigger context in which one has to understand migration in India. That is, migrant workers have very little political voice in their destination regions, though they can have fairly important voice in the source regions. And with their remittances, with a lot of their clout, they actually do shape a lot of outcomes in the source region itself. Right. So that's one of the reasons why this whole class of workers, 100 million, so to speak, was a blindside. But I'll start also with some historical context, because you can't really understand migration in India without understanding a bit of history. So this is a picture that you're seeing here. But if you see this picture on the other side of the screen, this is pretty much what happened more than 100 years back as well, right? And this is during another pandemic called the plague pandemic, 1896 onwards. And it's instructive that back then, if you see the images, they're very same. In both images, the migrant workers are fleeing the cities. Of course, the difference is that the British actually thought through one aspect, that is, they actually arranged for the trains, special trains for migrant workers to take them back home, which also the Indian government did, but 2 months late. Right? So we ran the Shramik trains in the month of May last year, but they were 2 months too late. And in that process, we got. So there's a lot of ways to think through, the policy decisions of should one shut down the Indian railways at 4-hour notice period? I think the broad lesson from last year is that no. In fact, there were a lot of examples from history. In China, I tried this out in 1911, proved to be a major humanitarian crisis and so on. So one big learning from last year is that migrant workers matter. And that's why you see this huge shift away from a national lockdown, shutting down the Indian railways kind of approach that was tried last year to a very different approach during the pandemic this year. A quick run through, what we're talking about when we talk about migration. In India, I would say the best way to understand migration for work in particular is by duration. The temporary seasonal is typically the shortest duration. They have a few months. Think of sugarcane harvesters. Often a lot of this is rural to rural migration. It's seasonal, which means the migrant workers are going away. There's a slack season in the agricultural calendar, and the migrant workers are going away. Semi-permanent is when think of the security guards on your campus, or the cooks, or the plumbers, or this vast urban informal economy is what is typically semi-permanent. What it means is that these people are working in the cities for a long period of time. They go back home during the year for 1 or 2 months for vacation or for during the monsoon, but they do not retire in the cities that they have chosen to work in. Okay, so they are basically working for a long time in the city, but they retire back home. So the whole strategy, the migrant strategy, is to earn as much money as possible and to save, for a retirement back home. And permanent is when the person kind of settles down in the city for long. Now in India, we say seasonal plus semi-permanent is what is called as circular migration, and permanent is a non-circular. Now, what are the numbers like? What we're saying is that altogether there are about more than 100 million of them, but the bulk of this is actually circular migration. Right now, I won't give you an exact split between seasonal and semi-permanent between that, but just to say that seasonal migration could be about 30 million and semi-permanent is much, much more. It could be more than 50 million or so. So that's the kind of breakup that we're talking about. And seasonal is much more in construction, is much more in farm harvesting. Semi-permanent is much more in manufacturing, also in construction. Semi-permanent is much more in this, as I said, this vast urban informal economy. I'm going to show you a map to kind of give you a geographic sense of where migration takes place from. And of course, migration takes place from a variety of reasons: marriage, work. Virtually every Indian woman is a migrant because of marriage and so on. But when you think of migration for works, very specifically, it is heavily male selective. Most migrant workers in India in the cities who have left their homes are either single male migrants or they have gone with their friends and so on, who also happen to be men. This varies from region to region, but there's a lot of selectivity in terms of gender, in terms of caste. The short-term migration streams are overrepresented by the scheduled caste, for example. The longer-term migration streams are overrepresented by the non-scheduled caste, general category, and so on. Not so much difference by religion. And region is really the main thing, right? Which means it depends. If you grow up in a place where there's a lot of migration, you're likely to migrate. It doesn't matter whether it's your gender, caste, religion. Region is really the most important identity when it comes down to affecting migration choices. All right, and why people migrate? This is just going through the obvious stuff. Obviously, people are going for better opportunities, but it is also more than economic. For example, this second point, which is anonymity of the city, is very important. A lot of people move not just because there's a larger income to gain, but also because of the anonymity. You can start up enterprises and you won't be shunned because of that. It is to escape caste oppression in villages, as Ambedkar famously pointed out. So a variety of reasons. And of course, there are periodic shocks like a flood or a cyclone, which also push people out. Now, migration in India has been happening for a really long time. And as I started out, I showed you two pandemic pictures 100 years apart. And in both times, circular migrants were fleeing the cities. In fact, fleeing the city is one of the stylized fact in a pandemic. This chart is just to tell you about how persistent male circular migration is in India. Right? This is a chart on sex ratios across 110 years. And you'll see that, Udupi Ratnagiri have had female surplus, which means the men are outside these districts. These are source regions of out-migration. They've had these elevated sex ratios now for more than 100 years. So what we're talking about in India is generations, in this case, 4 generations of migrant households who are sending out their sons to work out there, and then they come back, and then their sons go out there to work, and then they come back. And so this is kind of a repetitive process which is happening for more than a century. So this is the core map which I want to talk about, and you'll see why this is important when we talk about the pandemic. Now, this is data from 2007-8, and you'll say that, this must be outdated data. But as I'm pointing out, migration patterns in India are extremely long-lasting and persistent, which means even if you took a survey of India today, I would be surprised if you found something substantially different from this, right? Which means that the major districts sending out migrants in India come from Eastern UP, Bihar, coastal Orissa, from the West Coast, but the West Coast migration is mostly towards the Gulf countries. Think of Kerala and the Gulf. This is just a map of out-migration. The red shaded districts are those which have the percentage of houses with a migrant who has gone in search of work. Right? So it's a simple metric. It's a household level metric. You'll see even districts in Gujarat, Amreli and so on, send out people. Even within Maharashtra, a lot of districts send out people. Then there's huge cluster in Rajasthan. Not so much in Haryana, Punjab, which are receiving states. Again, a lot in the hill states of Uttarakhand and Himachal. And even Nepal, if you add Nepal to this chart, you will see that there's massive out-migration from Nepal to India and other places. Right now, you'll see that much of central India out here does not actually migrate out that much compared to other places. And this is again because of history, because of how the social networks were formed more than 100 years back, and those have proved to be long-lasting. I've drawn 4 circles on this map, and those four circles are not, the red shaded districts are pretty much semi-permanent migrations. Right? So these are the classic features of what I call as the Great Indian Migration Wave, in which it is semi-permanent, it is male-dominated, and since y'all work on financial inclusion and so on, virtually all of this migration generates massive amounts of remittances. Right now, my last estimate of remittances based on this data, 2007-8, was more than $10 billion, the domestic remittance economy. Now, you can just project that to today, it's going to be many, many times more. So what we are basically saying is that the red shaded districts of India are essentially remittance economies. It's not just the case that some people are migrating. We're saying that in these districts, more than 25% of households send out people. We're saying that effectively more than 25% of households are receiving remittances, right? So 1 in 4 households, if you walk in the village in these places, 1 in 4 houses are getting money from outside. Now, this is mass migration, how we define it. And as you go down to the taluk and the village level, many times you're finding it to be 40%, 50%, 60%, the numbers just keep going up. Right? What it also means is that even if a household does not migrate, the economy of these villages in those places is almost completely run by remittances. Think of Kerala, where the money is coming from the Gulf, and it's completely in Kerala, the remittance to GDP ratio is something like 30%. Right? So if you add up all the international remittances, and if you take the GDP of Kerala as the denominator, that's 30%. So Kerala is one of the most remittance-dependent economies in the entire world. Bihar, UP, you might think is also, but the fact is that domestic remittances on a per capita basis are much lower than international remittances on a per capita basis. And that's why the remittance to GDP ratio in UP, Bihar is not as high as 30% as in Kerala. You should also know that Goa and Punjab also receive a lot of international remittances. Even their remittance to GDP ratios are more than 10%. We don't think of Punjab as a migration state, but a lot of people from Punjab go to Canada, Italy, and so on. And similarly with Goa, we think of people going to Goa, but actually a lot of people from Goa leave Goa and go outside to work internationally. Now, in this cluster, of course, the UP, Bihar, and Orissa cluster, Jharkhand, and even West Bengal. If you ask me what's changed from 2007 to now, the one state which has really emerged on the migration map of India is West Bengal, right? And so a lot of Bengali laborers are now found around India, especially in Kerala and so on. Now, from the point of view of financial inclusion and so on, the key thing to note with migration is the remittance. Right? And the remittance economy is massive. And that is why when migrant workers go back home during a lockdown or are stuck out of a job, it's not just the urban economies which collapse, it's the rural economies which collapse, because rural India and urban India is tied financially through remittances. But it's not all of rural India. It's these 150 odd districts, which are shaded in red out here, which comprise of something like more than 20% of rural India, which get hit massively whenever there's a recession in the remittance market. And this has happened even in non-pandemic times. For example, the people from Orissa work in Surat. There was a diamond industry kind of recession. There was a textile industry recession in the last 15 years. A lot of migrant workers went back. And so Ganjam district, which is thousands of kilometers away from Surat, gets affected because of a global shock through this remittance channel. And so that's why in the pandemic, while we say that we say this, that the first wave did not affect rural India much, that's not entirely true in the economic sense. It's true in a epidemiological or demographic sense. Rural India was hit, and we also see good growth in agriculture and so on. But rural India was hit massively because remittances dried up, and a lot of rural India in these districts is run by basically what's happening in urban India, right? And so that's one way to think through the impact of wave one on rural India. This is just to kind of show you, out migration versus urbanization. Obviously, the places which are sending a lot of people in Eastern India are also less urban. And so that's one of the issues on hand. So let me come now very specifically to the pandemic, having laid out this context of where people move from. Last year, we found a lot of people moving back. Now, so the first question to ask is how many people move back? And my number for that is about 30 million. This number includes both intrastate and interstate and so on. But the government now actually does have a number, and I'm using this map from a piece which just came out yesterday, not by me, but by two bureaucrats who work with the Indian Economic Service. And so this is a chart which was just generated yesterday. And if you see what the government is now claiming, they're claiming that about 11 million people. My number is 30. So my number for interstate is also much more. About 11 million people return. I mean, we know from the Shramik train data itself that about 6 million people returned just by those trains, special trains in May. I have no idea how the government has come to this number, but this is a number which must have been supplied by state governments. It's a lower bound of how many people actually went back, right? But 1 crore people going back is substantial because each migrant worker is typically going back to one household. So we are talking of about 10 million households, in which 11 million households, in which suddenly remittances have dried up for months on end, right? So that's the first wave kind of shock. Now, how do we think through this more specifically? What did these migrants do after they went back? One good way to look at is what happened to Manrega. And again, this is a chart from this piece which came out yesterday by these two bureaucrats or two members of the Indian Economic Service. You'll see that the first wave, the Manrega uptake was much more than the second wave, right? Because why? The national lockdown last year was much more stringent, and the income loss was much more sharp and steep than what we've seen this year. But what's also instructive, and this is very up-to-date data, it's just from data ending May, you'll see that the level of Manrega has been higher with respect to the pre-pandemic levels substantially, right, over this entire period. Okay, so you see this one-time spike May, June, and that's the really key period, in which the migrant workers went back. And as they started coming back to the cities by September last year, the Manrega uptick kind of falls. And of course, it's been high throughout, and that's the critical point that a lot of these economies are hit substantially. Now, a lot of these districts in which Manrega went up they were all sorts of districts, migrant, non-migrant, but definitely a lot of the returning migration districts were definitely up. Now, I don't know the exact split between men and women. It's quite likely that a lot of this uptick was about returning migrant workers, but I'll just put a caveat here that we still don't know the compositional split of this. And my research on migration suggests that most of the circular migrant workers in India are precisely the kind of migrant workers who will not do Manrega work, right? Because they're going and working in urban informal economy jobs. Manrega, as we know, is the kind of the least, it's the bottom end of the job ladder, right? So it could be used as a social security mechanism, but for a lot of people, it's also beneath the dignity. It's just something you don't do in your social class, right? Because these migrant workers are drawn across all castes and classes who are going back. So I would say that out of those 1 crore workers who went back, I wouldn't know what percentage exactly worked in Manrega, but my sense is that number would be small. But the compositional shift that what we are observing also, and again, this is not with hard data, but with again ground level reporting, is that a lot of households who were not migrating also started taking the uptake in Manrega simply because remittances dried up, and when remittances dry up, basically the local economies collapse even for the non-migrating household. And that's the key thing that I want to emphasize, that it's not just households which send out migrants which got affected. Households which do not send out migrants also got affected in the pandemic in rural areas in particular, precisely because the remittance economy which sustains their jobs, right? So think of a classic mobile phone repair shop in a rural India. If the remittances dry up, there's not going to be much money there, and even those businesses, what we call as rural farm and non-farm employment, also kind of gets affected. Now, this is a very key chart because what we're saying is that Manrega not only acted as a good shock absorber last year, mitigating to some extent, but in the world of migration, I would say it was not the biggest thing. Most migrant workers, in my view, sat out and basically did nothing for 2-3 months last year. And they were desperate to come back to the cities as soon as possible. Right? And that's exactly what happened. Different survey estimates that I have seen, but most of them are pitching it at something like 60 to 90% of workers came back. Right? So I don't know which states sent out more workers and so on, but in general, the number is more than 50%, which means most of the workers have came back by the end of last year. And then, of course, we got the second wave this year, the brutal second wave in, from starting from middle of February and then really intensifying in April and May. And of course, you did not see the migration, the horrendous migration crisis kind of visuals like we saw last year, but migrant workers were, of course, affected. And of course, we'll get to know that data only in a few months from now. But obviously, with effective state of lockdown in a variety of cities, the situation has been very bad. What's different is, of course, that the number of migrant workers who went back is much smaller than what happened last year, which also means that as economies unlock now in the coming few months, the economic impact is going to be much more muted than what we saw last year, where migrant workers stayed out of the urban job market often for 4 to 5 months. This year, my sense is that's going to be cut down to a few weeks, which is a much more positive sign than what happened last year. The key, of course, now, I'll come to the policy options towards the end, but the key is to kind of ensure that migrant workers, those who have gone back, come back as soon as possible in going forward. This is again just to tell you, the difference in Manrega kind of uptake in the first and the second wave. This is again charts from these people's work. And you'll see that in the first case, the Manrega uptake was broadly there everywhere. Of course, it was much more in West Bengal, UP, Orissa, some of the migrants sending out states, but you'll see it was there everywhere, even in Gujarat, where I'm based right now. But you'll see that this year, for example, it seems to have been much more in the states of Bihar, Jharkhand, Odisha, Madhya Pradesh. Surprisingly, not so much in UP, but then there was also a base effect out there. So the difference in Manrega uptake as one proxy of absorbing migrant workers going back seems to be, again, very different. And again, wave one and wave two responses of migrant workers have been very, very different. I'll tell you what has changed between wave one and wave two. A lot of employers have become much smarter. And so a lot of employers are actually now concerned about migrant workers. A lot of construction sites have made facilities where migrant workers can live, in decent conditions. And so the impetus to go back has also kind of reduced compared to last year. Right. And so come back to this question of why did so many people go back? Because ultimately, if you want to understand migration and financial decision making, it comes back to what drives the migrant psychology. Last year, the reason why people went back was on both the fronts. That is, there was no economic security in the cities, and social security was likely to be provided in the villages, which means ration cards and so on enabled you to access the PDS back home. And then you had family back home. So it was a natural psychological response. I would say also a cultural response to go back home during times of crisis. The difference between wave one and wave two, of course, is that in wave two, rural India has also been battered in a demographic sense. Last year, it was more in the economic sense in the remittance economies, not so much in a demographic sense of people dying and so on. But this year, rural India is also hit, which is another concern of why migrant workers did not necessarily go back in large numbers this time around, is because if you go back, also there's a huge risk of the virus, and also greater risk that you'll probably get the virus to that village. And I'll point out this comparison between the late 19th century, where migrant workers in Bombay, for example, often had to make this choice of leaving Bombay because of the plague or going to Ratnagiri district where a famine was there, right? And so you're caught between the devil and the deep sea. And so that's a similar situation this year, which was not there last year. Last year, people went back in large numbers precisely because the incomes dried up. But most importantly, there was very little credibility of when the lockdown was eventually going to end. Because if you remember, it was first for 21 days and then kept getting extended again and again and again. Right? This time, again, lockdowns are getting extended, but you'll see that it has not been as stringent. And in many places, work has been going fairly normally. And so the impact on migrant workers has not been that much. Of course, some sectors like restaurants, hospitality and so on have been brutally affected. And migrant workers in those places, their income drop must have been very, very large. Let's start wrapping up slowly. This migration and the pandemic, when you see this in conjunction, you should understand that pandemics thrive on migration, right? And which means if you want to curtail pandemics, you do have to curtail mobility. But it's much more easier to curtail international mobility than internal mobility, right? Because as we've seen last year, when we tried to curtail internal mobility, shut down the railways, it brought us an even bigger crisis, which made it even worse, in fact, in some sense, because a lot of people congested in those relief camps and so on. So the question is, how should it be curtailed, especially at the onset of a pandemic, but also during different waves? And my sense is that you should shut down airspace, international airspace, and so on, but you should not shut down domestic travel. Right? In the sense that what we did last year was completely against the playbook of pandemic management and migration. Of course, mobility, localized restrictions is what we opted on during the second wave, and that's really what we should be doing going forward as well. So in this world of migration and pandemics, what are some of the policy options? And I was thinking of this, and I jotted down 4 in particular, but I'd be happy to take questions on various other things as well. The first one, which has been on the cards for more than 15 years now, maybe more than 10 years, is what is known as portability of social security. Today, the buzzword is one nation, one ration card. The sad point is that migrant workers in general, the sense from the ground is that nobody really knows about this. So there's a massive awareness gap about the one nation, one ration card, which by the way is still not fully operational. Okay, so after 3 years of tinkering around, it's still not fully operational. But the one nation, one ration card is a good idea. It should be enforced, but migrant workers need to know about it. And so a massive communication kind of pitch has to be done. You know that the under the National Food Security Act, free food for a lot of families has increased, but that has to be done now irrespective of residence. And that's an important thing which needs to be specified in law, because the more you cushion social security in the cities, the less the need for migrant workers to go back home at the time of every pandemic wave that arrives. The second thing is rental housing, and you'll also know that there's been now a Model Tenancy Act which has been floated. This is a more long-term option, but one of the reasons why a lot of migrant workers left, last year and also this year, is because landlords and landladies demanded rents during the lockdown, right? And because these rental contracts are not on paper, they can basically just use force to evict tenants. The government last year also announced, by the way, policy saying, you can waive off rents for a month, but it could not be enforced because, simply put, nobody had a written contract, right? So just something as simple as having a written rental contract. Most rental contracts of migrant workers are not written. There is oral or verbal contracts. And so just putting it down on paper and a better mechanism to enforce that would solve a lot of the issues in the rental housing market. Of course, the longer term issues that we need to create much more rental housing, and that's there. That would also make housing more affordable. And again, from a financial kind of inclusion point of view, you should know that rents is one of the biggest expenditures of migrant workers is rents in cities. So the more affordable the housing, the more likely that you're going to save on your incomes. Another thing we saw in this pandemic is that there was very little accountability of contractors. Contractors are often important intermediaries who bring migrant workers from villages to cities. Contractors, I should say, is only a small part of the overall migration economy. It's not like every migrant worker is coming through a contractor. In fact, most do not. Most are coming through family networks and so on. But those who do come through contractors were completely left out, to suffer basically on their own, because the contractors were the first people to flee during the pandemic. Right. So as the lockdowns hit, they were nowhere to be seen, and migrant workers were really caught out. Often these migrant workers don't know the language of the place that they're living in, and contractors are the only, literally the MyBab, so to speak, who look after them in the cities. And a way to enforce. When I say contractor accountability, it basically means that employers should know who they are hiring, even if it is outsourced, right? And so what we saw last year was that employers simply did not know that there was a crisis because the contractors had fled, and they were never really concerned about the employee at the eventual end. And finally, on remittances. Now, when you look at remittances as a kind of a financial issue, there's been a fair amount written on it. First point is, of course, that it's a huge part of the local economy. As I pointed out, for 150 districts of India, this is the economy. That is, these economies run on remittances. So if the city collapses, the village also collapses. So it's directly linked. When we think of remittances from a policy perspective, for the last 15 years, the focus, whether it was international remittances or domestic remittances, was on transaction costs. That is, how do we make remittances cheaper and cheaper and cheaper? Now, I think that kind of angle of policy making on remittances has maybe run its course, in which basically what I'm saying is that remittance costs have actually reduced. Of course, if there's a scope to reduce it further, great. Right? But because of phones, because of this whole massive switch to phones over the last 5 to 10 years, the transaction costs have reduced substantially. And so there may be a case that there's not much more one can achieve from reducing transaction costs for remittances. So as a policy goal, it's a great goal to have, but I don't think it's the burning goal per se. I think the key is really moving ahead to link remittances more directly with other financial products. And there's now good research to show how remittances can increase not only financial literacy, but also more savings behavior, which I think is the end goal of many of the stuff one does in financial inclusion. Of how do we create remittance products which are automatically channelized into savings, right? Which means you'll see that most of remittances is going into what? It's going into funneling consumption expenditure back home, right? Of course, it's kind of fun. You can't really say that out of 100 rupees sent back home, if you have a survey question of what are you using remittances for, you're not going to get a straight answer, because that's just adding to disposable income, and that's being spent on a variety of things. All you can say is that with 100 rupees less, you're going to spend 100 rupees less overall on a basket of things. It's migrant workers they don't keep a mental account saying that this 100 rupees sent back has to be spent on this. It's just adding to overall disposable income. But what if it was actually linked of that 100 rupees, 10 rupees has to go to a savings product at the household level, right? And you get some incentives to do that. I think that's the kind of policy angle which I would be very excited about, because we are seeing a lot of the remittance economy just driving a very kind of consumption behavior, and not really much in the savings and investment behavior, which has been noted in different points of the world at different points of time to being a sustainable path where migration and remittances can do good for the source region through remittances. Unfortunately, in India, a lot of the remittance economy is not moving into much of productive investments. And the key is, how do you convince migrant workers to start doing more of that? Because if you want long-term growth in these regions, eventually migration rates will fall because of that growth. Those remittances need to be funneled into more productive kind of thing. So that's really the policy angle one has to be thinking. So with that, I'll end here. This is just a quick talk on pandemics. Just to also point out that history is very important. You can't really think of migration and pandemics without understanding that a lot of this has happened before. Even in 1897, the people in Bombay were sending back money through postal money orders. So stuff like financial inclusion, remittances, migration have a very, very long course in India. And anybody who wants to really understand this space has to read the history, for which there are 2 books which I have written. If you have the time, you should definitely check these books out. One is on migration, one is on pandemics. I also run a social media handle called Business and Economic History on Twitter and Instagram. All right, so with that, I'll stop and be happy to take questions. Thanks, Kamesh.
Thank you so much, Professor Tumbe. That was a great presentation. We have a couple of questions coming from the audience. I will just post it one by one. Starting with the first one, based on the learnings from last year's wave, could you say the problem of out-migration was handled better this time? And were better options created in destination cities themselves for them to stay back and have better social and economic security? If no, why do you think that is?
All of us are affected by the pandemic through the death, let's say 2 channels, the demographic channel and the economic channel. I think the way to really think about this is if you're asking a question of comparison, it is about what is different between wave 1 and wave 2. So first is what is different in the epidemiology, and then you have to think of what is the difference in the economic response. I think the epidemiological differences are huge between wave 1 and wave 2. The simple fact that wave 1 did not go into rural India that much, and wave 2 is completely small in India. In fact, I've written a piece on death underreporting in Gujarat. I'm finding a death underreporting factor of 11. Right? So don't go by reported cases and so on, or don't say that, Maharashtra has got more cases than UP, because the underreporting factors vary big time in wave 2, simply because it's gone much more into rural India. So if the wave 2 in an epidemiological sense has gone back, is much worse out here, it means actually that migrant choices are not the same as last year. Last year, the choice was very simple. Let's go back home because I don't have a job in the city. This year, it's if I go back home, I definitely am likely to basically put my family at risk, but quite likely that the village itself has been infected and I'm actually safer off in the city once, because there's kind of a progression. First it came to the cities, then it went to the villages and so on. So that's the reason why the migrant choices themselves, irrespective of what the government did, were very different in this wave and the last wave. You'll see what's happening. The minute an official lockdown is announced, you'll see the rush to the trains and the rush to the buses. Right? The smart communication this year was when governments did not announce lockdown. They got mobility reduced. If you look at Google mobility as a metric, Google mobility metrics reduced pretty much across the board in India, whether you announce a lockdown or not. Right? So that's the kind of interesting thing. And I think the state governments which probably did it better, which saw less exodus, were the ones which did not announce one fine day lockdown for the next one. Right? They very gradually started imposing restrictions on certain curbs Like in Gujarat, they said from pretty much the end of March, they started saying from 8 something like 9 p.m. in the night, basically night curfews. So it kind of built it up, right? Rather than one fine day saying, we saw what happened in Delhi this year when they did announce a lockdown late in mid-April, when it went completely out of hand. That's when you saw the rush to the bus stops and so on. So the lesson really is to not really announce a lockdown, right? And the word lockdown should not be used. In fact, that's the moral of the story, because the word lockdown is now synonymous with the visuals of last year, and hence people just want to go back because migrant workers think that okay, the trains are going to be shut down. Right? We got the crisis last year primarily because transport systems were shut down, right? And that's as simple as that. If the transport systems were open or even kept at minimal capacity, you would not have seen the visuals last year. So the big learning from last year, I think, both from the employer's end and from the government's end, was to keep some amount of transport systems open, right? Which I think is a good thing. Of course, you can say that that's a bad thing because that's spreading the virus everywhere. But it's a trade-off, right? And we saw what happened last year. I would say it's a good thing because if you don't, what you get is a migration crisis like last year, which actually makes the virus spread even more likely. Because what happens then is migrants are then in these, last year we had 20,000, literally like, refugee camps set up all over India. Right? That's the classic case of where you're going to get, more epidemic outbreaks. And like we saw in last year, it's impossible to keep people from going back. This is not like international migration where you can shut down the plane. Nobody's going to swim from UK to Bombay, but you can walk from Bombay to UP. And so that's why internal migration is very different, and you can't shut down cross-state border transport systems like last time. So on balance, I think we have dealt with the migration issue much better in the second wave than in the first wave, on account of the transport systems, on account of the fact that employers, I know many business associations who went out of their way to support migrant workers. I think the issues really came when state governments announced or used the word lockdown, and that's when you saw the sudden rush and very similar kind of response as what we saw last year. So there are a lot of learnings, and I think the experience of the last 2 months is going to be very important for guiding policy in future, because we are now learning what were the best responses in terms of restrictions. Last year, it was just a blanket national lockdown. But this year, each state has its own model, right? And each state is going to praise its own model, right? But it's up for researchers to say, okay, which kind of restriction made most sense, right? And so you need to track the Google mobility data. You need to see a variety of data to kind of get closer to what seems to have worked for migrant workers best this time around. Having said that, don't look at the reported COVID cases and deaths, because that's underreported by a huge factor.
Great. Thank you so much. The next question is coming from Rakshit, and he asks, you said migrants are largely invisualized in the policy sphere because of various reasons. One of the main reasons is also the broad anti-migrant sentiments in many places, and that also brush off on those running local state governments. How do you think we can tackle the sentiment so that governments can think of adopting the measures you're recommending?
Good question. I mean, basically, this question on how do we stop nativism in India. I wrote a piece in just 2 months back, actually. Haryana passed this 75% job reservation law for locals. It's completely anti-constitutional. This idea that reservation for locals is completely goes against many of the articles in our constitution. So I wrote an op-ed piece in the Indian Express, and the Deputy Chief Minister of Haryana responded to that, defending it, saying, no, reservations for locals is fine, and so on. So nativism of any kind, I'm dead against. Simply put, freedom of movement across state borders is enshrined in our constitution. There are some parts of India where you can't go, actually. For example, if you can't go to Nicobar Islands, you need to have a special pass for that. Some parts of India are off limits, but otherwise, you can go anywhere. And so any, nativism should be actively contested against. Unfortunately, the literature on nativism tells you very clearly that nativist sentiments are highest when there's high unemployment. Right? So the best cure for nativism is to have good growth, so that people are not really bothered about jobs and so on. Now, obviously, at a time like this, when you have massive unemployment, you can understand the nativist sentiment growing in various parts of India. So Andhra Pradesh tried this law. Madhya Pradesh is talking about 75% reservation. It's becoming like its own kind of epidemic of local job reservation for locals and so on. But it's going to backfire. I don't think it's going to be very sustainable. I come from Mumbai, Mumbai is a place which for about 50 years has had nativist sentiment, but there's a difference between rhetoric and policy, right? So though, political parties in Mumbai have been very anti-migrant in sentiment, occasionally some violence and so on, but on the ground, they've not really done anything. They never passed like a 75% reservation law. So it's dangerous when these politicians actually start passing these laws, right? And start making these very restrictive policies. Rhetoric should also be questioned, but rhetoric alone, does not change the ground reality. The fact is that Maharashtra needs those migrants. Gujarat, politicians can say what they want, but they survive on migrant labor from other states. So there's also a hard reality that politicians also have, I'm sure, understand. But you're right that, it should not go from rhetoric to policy. But the best way to cure nativism is just overall growth. That's when we've not seen natives. If you want to read about this, there's a good book by Myron Weiner. It's about a 30 years old book, but it's called Sons of the Soil. And it's probably the best work on India on nativism.
Great. Thank you. Next question is, given the huge role of that remittance play in migrant households, what is your view on the low level of uptake in formal payment mechanisms for sending back remittance to their household members? We see that the uptake of formal payment systems will remain low, and migrants continue to use informal mechanisms of finance. Your thoughts on that?
It's a good question. I don't know how to answer because I don't know the most recent numbers. If you have those numbers, I would love to know. It's also very tricky to understand what percentage of the domestic remittance economy is formal versus informal. My estimates came from 2007-8, where I said that most of it is informal. But at over 15 years, a lot of migrant workers have mobile phones. A lot of migrant workers have bank accounts. I would say that the remittance economy has formalized substantially over the last 10 years. I'd be very surprised. I mean, there are obviously different ways. In Gujarat, short distance migration, a lot of this happens to the bus conductor or the bus driver. Right? So the bus driver, so they give the money to the bus driver. The bus driver goes and at some stop, some relative comes and the person gives it. Right? So that's possible. Right? So that's but for long distance, remittance transfers, it's unlikely that they're giving train drivers, the cash to home and so on. Hawala channels, all those kind of things also seem to be much more muted. This is something I've studied. Yeah, I mean, Surat, for example, had this tappawalas who were this informal, money operators. They used to literally carry cash in trunks and so on at one time. But my sense is, the formalization story is very strong in the remittance market, and migrant workers use bank transfers, use a lot of things nowadays to get it. So the first part of the question is, how my sense is the extent of informalization a problem? Maybe not, but I'd be happy to be proven wrong. But I need to see some numbers for that, and I simply don't have the latest numbers on what percentage of migrants are using informal mechanisms. If, however, migrants are using informal mechanisms, typically we know the transaction costs are much higher, right? And so that's a question, that's a puzzle for researchers as to why would migrant workers use higher transaction cost mechanisms when there are lower transaction cost mechanisms available. And that boils down to using personal networks, friendships. I mean, all informal remittance mechanism is based on social network kind of based kind of a thing. So if you want to overcome that, you have to basically go to migrant workers and convince them, saying, look, I'm giving you a product where you don't have to, there's virtually no transaction cost, and please use it. I mean, that's the only way you can overcome some of these channels. So that's my sense of this topic.
Great. We have one more question on the remittance economy. Then this is coming from Bindu. Her question is, in our experience, the remittance economy is also an important way in which rural households manage natural disaster risk through one-off transfers. One would imagine that this has also been challenging in the last year in the face of Cyclone Tauktae, etc. Do you know more about this?
Good point. There's a lot of work on disasters and remittances, and it conforms to exactly what you're saying. That is, when there are disasters, remittances go up. In fact, I've been observing this from the early 20th century. The cyclones in coastal Odisha, there's been a super cyclone virtually every 10 or 15 years. There were massive inflows of postal money orders from Burma. People used to go to Burma back then from Punjab, and massive inflow of postal money orders in the early 20th century from Burma to coastal Odisha, just like you see from Gujarat to Odisha now every time there's a cyclone. I'll just say that, again, there's no hard information, hard data on this, but from, ground reports, from stories and so on, in the pandemic context, I do think last year there was a lot of reverse remittances, which means a lot of money was flowing from rural India to urban India to facilitate the migrant to come back. So a lot of people they'd kind of run out of money in the cities, and they wanted some money to buy a cycle, or just to get some basic stuff out, or to repay debts and then go back. Right. So that's one thing which happened last year, which was quite unique. Think of it: cyclone affecting the source region, pandemic affecting actually the destination region. And so the migrants were caught out in the destination and needed financial support from back home. So that's a phenomenon which I do think happened at substantial scale last year for those few weeks of that April, May kind of this thing. What about this year? This year now rural India is more hit, and I think the reverse is you're likely to see the reverse. That is the remittances are likely to go back much more. If you think of pandemic as a disaster like cyclone and so on, I do think that it must have gone back. We're already seeing so much of philanthropy from diaspora organizations. Diaspora organizations are within India. Think of Odia migrants diaspora associations in Gujarat. Think of Indian diaspora association in the US. In April and May we saw massive mobilization of resources for oxygen and variety of things outside India, sending it to various parts of India. So not just remittances, but what is called as diaspora philanthropy is a huge part of this thing about disasters. And I do think in the last 2 months we've seen a massive injection of aid or diaspora philanthropy going into urban and rural India, but also from migrants to support their families back home who might have been affected. But you're right that the larger thing I think holds that disasters do bring out remittances. But I think the way to think about it is, where is the disaster hitting? Is it hitting the source region or the destination?
Great. Thank you so much. The next question is, do you think the COVID-19 crisis has presented an opportunity to shape new migrant corridors for rural India and stop over-reliance on a few corridors?
What's the second part? Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Second part is for the rural India and stop over-reliance on a few corridors.
Sorry, I didn't get to stop over-reliance
on a few corridors.
Yeah, okay, so that's a good question. In the sense of, I showed you that migration map of districts, the out-migration districts of India. Will the pandemic fundamentally change that? My sense, again, and I look at this from a long-term view, is that the source regions of migration in India are going to be the same in the sense, by the time we end our lives 40, 50 years down the line with current life expectancy rates, believe it or not, Bihar will still be sending out migrants, UP will still be sending out migrants. Because the fundamental logic of out-migration is population density. These migrations will eventually stop only when the fertility transition has run its course, right? Just to put it in a very crude sense, India's poorest state, Bihar, and India's richest state, Kerala, on many dimensions, have the same rates of out-migration, right? And so it's not like a given that with the pandemic or with the development, a lot of shocks change. So once these networks are established, once a culture of migration sets in, having seen the historical experience of southern Italy, variety of reasons, it goes on for decades. It doesn't stop very, very fast. And so I don't think the pandemic is going to fundamentally affect the source region of migrations. That will get affected only when the density gets affected, and density will get affected when only you have fewer births and so on. So basically, when the fertility transition plays out, that's happening in Kerala. By the way, Kerala out migration rates are slowly falling because fewer people are being born in Kerala and so on. This thing about so what I'm saying is the same source regions, but your thing is new corridors. The new corridors could emerge from new destinations, right? And so I think that could be happening in the pandemic. And I'll give you some concrete examples. Mumbai, for example, last year, a lot of migrant workers went back to UP, Bihar, and so on. And suddenly you've found intra-state migration, that is from migration from districts within Maharashtra, plugging in certain parts of the labor market. For example, plumbing, for example, carpentry, for example, repair work. Stuff which was historically done by a few communities from few parts of, say, Eastern India. Because they had gone back, a new corridor potentially got created. Now, the key question is, That was a short-term effect. But typically from migration history, what we learn is that you have these shocks which then become very sustainable. Right? And so that's how a long drawn out migration corridor gets created over a large period of time. So it's quite likely, I think, the specific question, does the pandemic create new migration corridors? I think they will. We'll get to know the strength of those corridors only decades down the line. But it's quite possible that certain districts in Maharashtra went there. The second part is, I think, a story of diversification. I think that's also very true. And I've written about this, saying that a lot of households will rethink if they've been treated so badly in a particular destination. They're not going to stop migration, but they'll choose a new destination. Right? And so that rebalancing of, think of it as a portfolio decision of, also, many migrants, it's not like typically all the family members go to the same city. Sometimes it's like one son in Bangalore, one son in Bombay, and so on in a family. So that's a migration. That's like a portfolio decision of migration. Right? It could be the case, I think, that because some cities the migration experience was so bad last year that migrants could say. I mean, a lot of them told interviewers, news channels, and so on, saying they will never return back and so on. My sense is that's not ruling out migration, that's ruling out migration to that particular employer or that particular city. Right? And so that's how I think potentially new channels will come. In terms of where these corridors are, that's anybody's guess. But all I can say is in the last 15 years, the one part of India which has completely emerged on the migration map, out-migration map, which was not there earlier, is West Bengal. Right? And so the West Bengali migrant is not something you saw in the 1970s and 80s. But it's what you're seeing in the last 15 years in huge numbers now. So that's definitely a new migration corridor which is shaping, and they're going all over. It's not that they're just going to Kerala and so on. They're going to different places. So that's definitely a corridor which is shaped. And I do think the pandemic will reshape the corridors, but it's not going to dent fundamentally the source regions of our migration.
Great. We have time for one last question. And so what should the government do if we get third wave, if at all? More of a decentralized lockdown as in the second wave, or what else would you suggest?
Yeah, I think the first task is to vaccinate. I think that's the key. And let me point out, it reminds me, because I forgot to put this on the slide. In terms of policy options, the number one policy thing when we talk about migration right now is to vaccinate migrant workers, especially in the construction sector, especially in certain key sectors which employ millions of migrant workers. Very happy to see associations like CREDAI, which is a real estate body. They've promised vaccination of 2 crore migrant workers. I hope that happens, and that's not just a PR stint. But that's what's needed. Employers need to run massive vaccination campaigns for migrant workers. Because remember, migrant workers are very critical for not only the economy, but if migrant workers are vaccinated, precisely because they keep moving from place to place, right? You're protecting so many more places. You're not just protecting that place. You're protecting many more places by that kind of a campaign. So if you want to prepare ourselves for a third wave, we need to put migrant workers right at the forefront of our vaccination strategy. So that's very critical. In terms of how do we plan out for future waves, I think the model has been set now by this particular wave, that is localized restrictions. I'm all for localized. So between localized restrictions and national lockdown, I'm all for localized restrictions. Though having said that, you need to enforce localized restrictions. Right. And so I wrote a piece in the Mint on, I think, 28th April. It was titled "The Urgent Need for a Mobility Lockdown," pointing out that those state governments had started taking actions. You did not see it materializing on the ground. Right. So if you take Google Mobility Score, which I think is a good metric, huge variations across India. Some people were at minus 60% from pre-pandemic baseline. Some states were at a minus 10%. Right. So you can actually measure now localized restrictions. And I think you need to get districts or states below the minus 45% mark. This is minus 40% of visitors to places as compared to Jan-Feb 2020. It's a very neat metric that Google comes out with on a daily basis at the district level. And so my threshold is you should get districts at definitely below the minus 40% mark. And as cases go higher, maybe minus 60, minus 80. But the problem with this particular wave that we saw was how late. It was almost predictable. What we saw in Maharashtra happened in Delhi, it happened in Tamil Nadu, in literally spaced by 3 weeks. if Delhi had started restrictions earlier, if Tamil Nadu had started restrictions earlier, you would not necessarily have seen the kind of waves that we eventually saw in those places. So state governments also have to kind of respond in anticipation. I think the problem in this second wave was that there was virtually no anticipation, right? It was almost as if, okay, let's wait for the cases to go up, then we will start. But there has to be some anticipatory restrictions placed as well. And the thing is, you can measure these things. So I hope that's the way forward. That is, we start measuring the level of restrictions, its actual impact on the ground, and ensuring that there's no national lockdown. Nothing like shutting down the railways. I think I'm dead against stuff like
that. Great, Professor Tumbe. Thank you so much for this insightful session, and also thanks for the time to attend this conference. And now we will break for 15 minutes and resume at 5:15. Up next, we have a panel discussion on innovations in household finance and expert talk on finance for new to credit segment lined up. We look forward to your participation at 5:15. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Welcome back. Thanks for staying on. Now, I would like to invite the moderator for today's panel discussion, Deepti George. Deepti is the Deputy Executive Director and Head of Strategy at Dvara Research. She has built more than a decade of expertise in institutional design aspects of financial inclusion. Deepti has also had opportunities to contribute to various RBI committees, such as Medium-Term Path to Financial Inclusion and MSME Committee. She has also undertaken research for PFRDA and Mudra on their products for informal sector. Thank you so much for joining, Deepti. Hi, over to you now.
Thank you, Kamesh. All right.
Yeah.
Can you hear me well?
Yeah, Deepti. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Welcome to this panel discussion on innovations in household finance. So Dvara Research is actually uniquely placed to bring together three universes, so to speak, right, in financial inclusion. The research universe, the policy universe, and the practitioner universe. So while this conference is a platform to engage in and build an ecosystem of researchers interested in Indian household finance, we have also over the years, focused a lot on understanding and documenting challenges for financial services providers who are attempting to serve low-income households, and to undertake advocacy on policy design changes that can enable these participants to innovate. So one common theme that we have found in low-income households is that low-income households are generally considered as a segment that is distinct and separate and different from what's called the retail segment that is served mostly by the mainstream BFSI sector. And this has in some sense resulted in both product level as well as business model level regulations, rather than having a regulatory environment that actually aims to create a good environment for innovation, particularly in the segments related to low-income households. One can debate whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. There are various reasons why some of these steps were required, and perhaps it's time for a rethink on some of these things. But we have certainly found pitfalls, with this kind of an approach, such as that, for example, several protections aren't in place for products for low-income households. Sometimes products are highly inadequate for the low-income individual or the household. And there's also a kind of restrictions that result in a lack of flexibility for the provider who's trying to innovate at that level. So, and when we talk of financial services businesses, it's not just about understanding the end customer by bringing in both qualitative as well as quantitative research and data. It's also about other elements that have to come together, such as the right pricing, the market strategies, the ops team ready for a new product launch, are your customers ready for a new product launch? So at this panel, my hope is that is to get our financial services providers here to share their thoughts and learnings on how they've gone about innovation in their own businesses, as well as learnings from others that they would love to share. I'm not going to, so we have as panelists Rajiv Yadav, who is MD and CEO of FinCare Small Finance Bank, Venkatesh N, MD of Samastha Microfinance, RM Vishakha, who is MD and CEO of India First Life Insurance, and Bhavesh Jain, who is the Chief Revenue Officer at TransUnion Subsidiary. Yeah. Shall we just do a mic check just to make sure all of us can hear?
Hi, this is Rajiv Yadav. If you can hear me.
Yes, thank you.
Hi, this is Venkatesh here.
Hey, Venkatesh.
Yeah.
Hi, Deepti and everyone else.
Hi, Vishakha.
Hi, this is Bhavesh Jain here.
Hi, Bhavesh. All right, so thank you so much for joining. I'm going to get right away into the session. And so sort of, I would like, love for us to spend some time on just the theme on product innovation. It's been, it's been lately clogged quite a bit, but then let's really understand what are our panelists' thoughts on this. So I would maybe ask Vishakha to begin. So there are several kind of products which seem to be missing in the markets, which are not certainly visible to low-income households. We're talking of adequate life insurance, health insurance, accident insurance, savings products that are flexible, that give a good interest in terms of returns, line of credit type products versus the term loan. So in your view, would you consider this as a design challenge, or is it actually a distribution challenge?
Deepti, if you had asked me this question about 4 years back, I would have probably told you design challenge. We really don't have products that are flexible, where Customers can have a pay-as-you-go kind of a savings or pay-as-you-go kind of an insurance, where customers can insure themselves by paying as low as, say, 10 rupees per month and so on and so forth. Okay. But at India First Life alone, we've launched products virtually covering all of that. And it's been my passionate drive, because of which we managed to launch products. It's been a battle fought with regulators, to be able to get 100 rupees single premium recurring policy, more like a khata. And I'm not really marketing my product, but I'm giving you context of the product so that there is some understanding around the table. This is a very simple. You can every customer can pay 100 rupees whenever he has it or she has it, and you can choose a 5 year or 10 year, and it is a single premium drop, which can be like a khata, so like a bank account. So you keep adding money whenever you have. You're covered for 10 times, or you're covered for 5 times, and so on. Obviously single premium. But because it is a micro product, the regulators were willing to give us a 10% commission on that. But they were really small ticket sizes, right? Because we were talking even in terms of 100 rupees to 500 rupees minimum ticket size. Distributors didn't want to sell at 100 and 500 because even a 10% on 100 was 10 rupees. They were getting more for doing something else. And we went ahead and we said, all right, let's do a minimum 2000. But we haven't got any takers for it. We tried to, then we launched something called a micro budget. We haven't got takers for it. We launched something called a HospiCash, which was a 3 rupee product. Okay. We said you can just sell it to anybody. All your daily wage laborers, for instance, people don't go to the hospital because they don't want to lose on their daily wage. So by paying this kind of a premium, they can get a 2-day HospiCash cover. So today, I don't think and I've gone to distributors with it. I've gone to almost every microfinance that we are aware of. We've gone to a lot of companies, and everyone shows interest. But when they realize what the effort is worth, and even if it's an integration, and maybe I'll hear it better from the MFIs, but we haven't been able to crack the reward versus return and for the distributor, and put the customer focus there and spend enough time on integration. Even something like integrating a savings component into a term policy that almost every MFI sells. Every MFI sells a GCL, okay, and they take that premium back from the customer. I said, why don't we add 10 rupees to that and do a micro savings? That I've not discussed with too many people, but the 2 or 3 that I did discuss with never got a pullback. So I think, Dipti, on the basis of the entire background I've just stated, with authority, I will say that the issue is with distribution and not with product innovation. Can't hear you, Dipti. You're on mute.
Sorry, thanks, Vishaka. So I just want to maybe bring in Venkatesh into this conversation, right? And notwithstanding the distribution, because your microfinance has somehow solved the distribution challenge there. But then, what is your sense of this? We have these alternative themes even within design itself around flexibility versus structure, where because microfinance is a fairly rigid product. And there's a lot of research which shows that a lot of low-income households want rigidity, both on the loan as well as the savings side. And not so much on the loan, but really definitely on the savings side. Now, we just want to hear from you, what are the ways in which, and have you considered microfinance contracts that are perhaps designed in a manner that provides some form of flexibility while maintaining their core structure, right? Would you have learnings to share? Because I know there's a lot of research that has experimented with flexibility in the microfinance space, and we don't have anything sort of like clinching to say, okay, this is exactly what we should do. But there's a lot of evidence that households need flexibility in terms of access to short-term loans, not so much of microfinance construct. So I just want to hear your thoughts on this.
Thanks, Deepti. I mean, in terms of the product innovation, in terms of the flexibility, what at least we are trying in a couple of pilots across is, when we are onboarding clients, it's more of the plain vanilla product which we can offer. And once we offer that product, I think so the work starts there. for us. We have, in a couple of geographies which we have started this pilot, where we say we can segregate customers into 12 to 15 kind of different customer profiles. Once we identify, over the next 6 to 9 months is where we try to collect more information. So we have changed our, we have something called the loan utilization check called the LUC. We changed it into something called collecting more details of the customer. Once we got these details of the customer, we are able to, from the second cycle onwards, we are able to segregate according to the customer profile and give some flexibility in terms of the repayment and all those things. We have not scaled up this part of it, but we see, I think so it works given, the COVID situation also. We have seen in some of these clientele where we are given some flexibility, things are working. So I think so it's we are able to find some success in terms of once you start segregating customers. But the challenge was with us is when we onboard customers for the first time, we were not able to differentiate because our loan officers didn't have that kind of an understanding of customers. So over a period of time, we were able to get more information, and internally we have worked on this. So with aspect to flexibility, yes, we are working on it. And it's also a need of the hour, given the microfinance model is being tried and tested, and there's slight bit of fatigue among the customers also, whether they want to do the JLG model or something. So we are keeping the group kind of a thing, but group is not for joint liability, but for ease of collection, we have worked on certain things. So it is helping in the ground level.
Thanks, Venkatesh. So I just wanted to kind of bring attention to a comment that Vishakha had, which is that microfinance and microinsurance distribution are not comparable because one gives money while the other asks money for risk, right, on long-term savings. And that the interest on microfinance is in some sense priced into the loan cost. So I think this is not something that in the research for us, in the research universe, I think this is something that we all know. But I think it's important for outsiders and all of the kind of people here to really understand this nuance, right? That between credit versus insurance, we are talking of completely two different products. One takes money. In some sense, the household is taking a risk on the insurer when you are purchasing into a life insurance. Whereas in the credit, it's the reverse. The lender is actually taking credit risk on own books, and in some sense, it's much easier for you to price it as the servicer, as a service provider to the household there versus micro insurance. So it's a great valid point there. I just wanted to
I have one point to add on. Can I just add one point in terms of the investment side? I heard Vishakha out, but it's very difficult in terms of the distribution aspect of it. But what we have done recently is we have tied up with Calidofin. Basically the education both at our customer level and our own field officers was a bit of a challenge. So, but our pilot in Tamil Nadu in terms of the savings aspect of it is showing some traction, barring this the COVID scenario. But till that time, we were able to show a good traction. But we needed an intermediary like Calidofin because we don't have that kind of a bandwidth to allocate for supporting such a thing. So with their intervention and them training, we are able to give some extra financial literacy for our clientele. This has also helped us in this the product takeoff actually.
Sure. Thank you. So I just want to get Rajiv into the conversation. Rajiv, you've been helping this transition for FinCare from microfinance provider to a full-fledged bank with depositing informations and also a suite of credit products, right? So here, I think the question between questions for researchers are really around this trade-off between simplicity versus sophistication, right? The question is a simple what's a simple product? Should we consider it as simple for the consumer versus simple for the provider to give? And I think very much linked to this is this question of standardization versus customization. And so how has, how have you been thinking about this? And also beyond FinCare itself, if you had other learnings to share, what kind of solutions have, that are being designed around the kind of unique needs of households, and how is this trade-off between delivering a simple product versus a sophisticated product or a customized product? So just over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Deepti. Clearly, I think a larger learning in the financial inclusion world prior to becoming a bank and continues to be after becoming the bank is that for the customer segments that we deal with, the products have to be in a manner where they can be understood by them. So simplicity obviously can be argued from not from a lender's perspective or the institution's perspective, but I think we all worry about that we should not do something which is not well understood. There should not be too many fees. There should not be any late penal charges or bounce charges or delayed payment charges. We try and keep our system configurations and our structures as simple as possible so that there's no potential point of mis-selling or dispute with our borrowers, because this set of borrowers fundamentally come with a lot of faith, and lack of literacy is clearly there. And we do not want a reputation of our bank's employees or the bank itself that there is anything which is not understood by them, and therefore the complexity has to be kept in mind. I would say from a banking transition perspective, the one good thing which has happened is, we are in a position to offer a savings account to our customers. And that is the key to almost everything and anything that we can think of about doing better business or better options to the customer, more flexible to the customers. And let me explain. When you're a microfinance company, as Venkatesh rightly said, that industry, that business works on a very simple principle, and which is done on large scale, repetitively, which is good for the borrowers and good for the lending institutions. And it's very difficult to bring in what we call a non-standardized cash flow, because it leads to potential misuse by the employees, by the customers, and then you lose all control over the business, because it's primarily a cash business. So in that single product line, although the execution is extremely good, but it leads to virtually limited flexibility for the customer. But as a bank, as a FinCare bank, we have taken a view that for every MFI customer of ours, we would definitely offer a FinCare savings account or zero balance savings account for the customers. The moment we do that, now all the optionalities come in. Now, what as a bank we have done? We have started, so we have a savings account. Then we have DBT linked into the savings account. We have given a debit card for the savings account. So the first and foremost, the customer need not withdraw the money the day we disburse the money. So that's the first level of flexibility. The money can be withdrawn from any ATM. It doesn't need to be concerned to our branch. The third, when DBTs come into their account, they can withdraw it again at their convenience, at the closest point of cash withdrawal. Fourthly, we started doing a simple product, and you alluded to it yourself, Dipti, is about a simple recurring deposit product, which is like a micro insurance in its own ways. But it's a recurring stream, which you say, okay, we take an instruction and we will deduct it from your savings account every month. And then it becomes a process in itself. So because of a savings account being the fulcrum, we've been able to offer a lot more products and a lot more flexibility to the customers. And I think that is the key benefit that we've been able to transmit to our borrowers by becoming a bank.
So I have a quick question on that, just to continue that theme. How have your microfinance customers taken to the fact that here is an opportunity for me to interact with the institution through a non-standardized kind of fluctuating cash flow contract, right? Where I can decide when I want to put the money.
So I would say the cash flow for the microfinance loans is consistent installments, but the cash flow on what they can take out from the bank, and it's primarily they're not really in a position to deposit cash. Okay. And they really, I don't think a need exists for them to deposit cash. The savings account are primarily used to get cash from the government in various forms, and they should be in a position to withdraw cash. So I would say And we are glad a lot of our borrowers may not have even got the DBTs because their current accounts may not be linked to the Aadhaar DBT linkage. So having an account is one thing, but having a linkage to it, whether it's coded in the government record that this Aadhaar account number is linked to this savings account, is an exercise in itself. So we have about 30% of our customers who get DBT into their accounts, and which has been phenomenally good in this phase of the pandemic, because a lot more DBTs have come in. So I would say, Deepti, the cash flows are they clearly withdraw the money using the debit card, so they got comfortable with that. But from our receipt of cash, it's still a predictable cash, it's still a consistent cash.
Got it. Okay, so I'm going to bring in Bhavesh here. So I think in both insurance and credit underwriting, I think one big hurdle is information asymmetries. There's a lack of information on the lives of low-income households and individuals. So how is this being overcome in the specific context of, credit bureaus, like in the case of low-income households, particularly when we're talking of new to credit as well as new to banking customers?
Sure. Thanks, Dipti. So obviously, few years back, to underwrite a new to credit customer was a challenge for the industry. And we are much better off right now as compared to a few years back for multiple reasons. Obviously, the information or the depth of information available is not as rich as compared to an established credit history consumer. But what are the options available today for a lender or an insurer to look at a new to credit customer or new to institution customer without any track record? There are multiple options. First, from a lending side, we recently launched a new to credit score, which is built upon the bureau lookalike and deviation from the norm. Let me explain a bit in detail. So if somebody is looking for an affordable housing loan in a Guntur district of say 5 lakh rupees of a certain age bracket, say between 40 to 45, one looks at this type of a borrower in the past and sees that what has been the performance of a bureau lookalike consumer in this particular segment which the lender wants to sort of underwrite. And based upon that constitution of bureau lookalike population, one can do the risk separation. So the new to credit score, which we deliver at a product level, we cannot sort of look at a borrower with the same lens, somebody looking at a housing loan versus somebody looking at a personal loan. So this new to credit score is delivered at a product level for a consumer looking for these different retail products across different age bands. And what it does is gives an objective underwriting tool to the lenders, similar to the current CIBIL score. So the industry has moved to a risk-based pricing using the CIBIL score. The new to credit score actually gives the lenders a good objective tool and gives them an opportunity, because the NTC score ranges from 100 to 200, 200 being the best. So what it does is that lender can actually price these NTC customers rather than saying complete outright no to NTC customers or charging a much higher rate of interest to these NTC customers. It helps them price the risk. Similarly to the CIBIL score being used for housing loan, personal loans, a regular credit history established customer. That's one way to solve for the information asymmetry. Second is in terms of multiple alternate data sources available from the credit bureau side as well as a lot of other sources. Say, for example, information around GST of a small trader, information about is in terms of utility repayments, whether it's in terms of electricity, telecom, sort of gas, a lot of other information which is available around, which helps a lender or an insurance company understand the repayment behavior of an individual, build surrogates around these in terms of repayment and establishing the ability and intent of an individual to pay. Similarly, somebody getting a PF credited, so the EPFO data available, the consented and non-consented. There are such multiple alternate data available, both consented as well as passive data sources available for a lender and insurance company to include it as part of their onboarding and underwriting journey. Now, along with this, what's important is that you make this entire decision-making objective to combine the structured data available in terms of the borrower, the KYC, or the individual, and combine it with a lot of the unstructured available on the alternate data ecosystem, and build your underwriting models combining the two. And it should be on the philosophy of learning as well, to be incorporated in those models. Have AI ML models where you sort of learn and train these models, because it's important, because you have a lot of unstructured data available, which is not sort of with a defined pattern, and you need to improvise upon your models using those sort of algorithms as well as AI ML models. So that's in terms of the approach being taken on solving the information asymmetry. Also, along with that is saying that how do we make sure that a lot of these data is available in terms of digitally, and keeping the consumer convenience in mind. So that's also an important factor to be incorporated while you look at solving the information asymmetry. So these are some of the tools available to solve for the gaps which existed in the past.
Okay. Thanks, Bhavesh. I think a question that I think all of us have in mind is, of course, you're a bureau, but then do lenders and other providers actually use this kinds of information? Is it easy to source, etc.? So I just want to bring in Rajiv here, and I want to fold that question into the larger question of costs, right? We're talking of not just cost for reducing information asymmetry, but also really cost around process innovation. So are there, and you're trying to kind of deepen your geographical focus and also shift from a standardized product to multiple products, and you've done that to a large extent. So what is that, and how has the journey been in terms of, other examples that you'd like to share here in terms of how some specific process innovations, so you've shifted from product, but we're going into process and perhaps even distribution innovation that you'd like to share?
Sure. I think just before the start of the bank and just after the bank, I think one thing that we went on, and I think we're early in that, was we truly digitized our microfinance sourcing in the field. And we adopted the Aadhaar-based eKYC process. It required a huge degree of change in the way we onboarded customers, the backend technologies, and we completely went from a paper world to a paperless world. Now, some of us may be able to appreciate that asking a basic KYC document from a customer is also onerous from the customer in terms of they have to get the original, they have to get a photocopy. We used to ask for a photo, and for a customer to even get a photo printed was an exercise in itself. What is so easy in urban places is not so straightforward when you're sitting in the center of a village. So the moment we went to eKYC, we stopped needing all these documents. You don't need a photograph. We don't need a photocopy of a document. We don't need to do a data entry. We do not make mistakes. We do not have bad scans of images to be data entered. So, and therefore we don't have a recurring process with the customers. When supposing the image is not clear, you go back and you say, this works, this does not work. Can you give me another document? So the whole process innovation, it was a journey of about 6-9 months, but we truly made it fully digital. And today we are at a world where we can tell the customers, and we have been there for about 3-4 years, we can tell the customers instantaneously if their loans have been approved, for what values they've been approved. In theory, we can run a process where we can disburse the loan in the same day, but for training the customer and for bringing in additional controls, we give it a gap of 1 or 2 days, and we do one more field check by the branch manager. We train the customers before we disburse. But I think this whole technological change is a huge change for the customer, and it saves real costs for the customer. It's not just about saving money for the bank, because as you all know, they are on daily wages. They lose money, and the more time we spend with them, the more we make them do things. There is a cost attached to it. So I think this has been very transformative, and there are various elements now that we can do with the same technology. But this one process change of onboarding customers using tabs, which our employees use, but an all instantaneous process all through, has been a big change for the microfinance world. And I think a lot of microfinance institutions today have also reached to that point and getting better.
Great. I think that's a wonderful example because here is a sort of a component within the process which is ancillary to the product sale itself, but it's greatly supporting access, so to speak. So I just want to bring in Vishakha here on sort of the customer lifecycle engagement, right? And we are talking in the context of insurance, where I mean, incentives is one big piece, and we've talked a lot about this with Vishaka and her other team members. But really, we know that incentives in insurance are stacked up front, and then we don't have a life cycle engagement that actually makes sure that customers are there, or other customers have a touch point that they can engage with meaningfully in order to gain benefits from the product that they have signed into. So I just want to ask, and I suppose insurance is only an example, but I think we're really talking about not just all, but post onboarding, we're talking about small ticket repeat payments, redemption transactions, grievance redressal. So could you talk about this, something that's very close to our hearts, but really the life cycle engagement?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things that we've tried to do in terms of life cycle engagement is to see, in an insurance, what is it, right? There are about paying of premium. It's about paying of renewal premiums. It's about knowing what's happening to your policy, and it's about making a claim. And let's address each of these separately. Okay, let's take a PMJJBY as one of the examples. Now, if you take the Pradhan Mantri Jeevan Jyoti Bima Yojana, the whole thing is digitized, right? Starting from debit to the customer's account to transfer, same day transfer to the insurance company, lodging of claims on portal, all documents being taken on WhatsApp, not insisting for death certificate, but willing to take the panchayat sarpanch certificate as a death certificate, ability to walk into any bank branch and look at the status of your claims in the claims portal that's accessible at every branch, and then the remittance of the money to the nominee's account, which also happens digitally. So the whole process from intimation to settlement is totally paperless and totally digital, can be accessed by the individual either directly on our portal and through WhatsApp, or can be accessed at the distributor's side. So that's one example. Now, if I take CSC, CSC is another, a common service center, which is one of the few organizations which is actually tied up with us, and has been a partner with us on almost all the micro schemes that we've tried to launch. And the entire thing there is again integrated. Whether it is onboarding, when you take onboarding, the eKYC, the remittance of premium through wallet payment of CSC, the pre-underwritten products that they sell, which enable instant issuance, the printing of policy at the CSC, the renewal premium intimations through CSC, the collection of renewal premium through that, intimation of claims there. So we've enabled for everything direct access to the insurance company, and then again the IBR, the website, which is all multilingual, right? Self-service through WhatsApp. So we've enabled a whole lot of direct engagement through multilingual and through technology. And we've also enabled all of this at the distributor premises. So today the portal access is there everywhere. Plus, of course, engagement through the mobile is one of the easiest now. Whether you talk about it as an interactive SMS, whether you talk about it as a voice blast, people can't hear, so you send message. Who can't read, sorry, and you're stuck with English and other means of communication. So we're now doing the entire communication through language and through voice blast. Yes, I mean, any other ideas will be more than welcome to pick on. We keep trying to see whatever we can. And I think that's the kind of integration. Technology has enabled us hugely to do this kind of an integration. Available at every point of sales. Wherever you have an internet connection, whether it is through your mobile or through a computer, you can access the portals and you will know the status. You can submit claims, you can submit redemptions, you can talk to our call center, you can do self-service. So there's a lot that's been done in terms of servicing and customer lifecycle engagement. Because, Dipti, I don't know what the popular perception is, but the structure of the products, which has changed in 2015 and then further changed in 2018, has zero incentives for an insurance company to lapse a policy. Zero. The only person who can benefit is a distributor because there's no clawback of commission in case of lapse, but the customer and the insurance company both lose in case there are lapses and the customer does not pay premium.
Okay, that's wonderful to know, and we really look forward to seeing, I think, seismic shifts in the way business is done on the insurance side across the industry, and not just some of these examples and steps that you yourself have put into place. So I just want to maybe shift gears and we start looking at what has been the demand side imperatives. And before we do that, I just want to mention that please feel free to continue adding questions to the chat option, and we'll get through to them in the last 15 minutes. That's at 6:15, so we have a bit more time to continue on some of these questions. But we're moving to the demand side, and here the question is, what prevents households from, really taking the plunge, committing to a product that is right for them? And there's tremendous amounts of literature that is trying to answer why. And so I think I would want to kind of talk about just a couple of them. One is around exclusion due to cultural norms. So I just want to bring in Venkatesh here to say, we are talking of sort of underwriting or like lending to sort of groups which otherwise aren't really considered as strong when it comes to creditors for repayment, and simply because I think there's just less historical data that's out there. So we're talking of if you're salaried, you're in adult male, income levels, literacy, all these are but we are not talking of them, right? In the low income context, we are really talking about accelerating finance to specific groups like women, low literacy levels, self-employed, no salary data, residing in rural areas. Is there any specific example that you would like to share where a well-thought-out intervention has actually significantly improved uptake and usage of a financial product for these sectors that we're talking about?
Yeah, even as we speak, we have close to around 98% of our borrowers being women. And as we started, this was sometime back in around 2015, 2016. We had a specific relationship manager to get in new clientele, which is actually not gotten into any of these products which we offer. So we started working with an NGO. The NGO was working in the periphery of a natural park in sanctuary, and they were trying to dissuade people to go into the forest and not to pick up firewood. So even before the central government's Ujala scheme, they were able to get in gas cylinders to them, and they were working with them. But these people were not used to any of the financial services products. So this NGO was catering to anywhere around 20 to 25,000 clientele, where they were able to get across the cooking gas cylinders to them. And for us, the thing is, historically, we have been used to clientele who are already open to some other financial institution or something. The training aspect, initially we took some time. They were a little hesitant. So the NGO also was quite supportive in terms of helping us through. So, even before we gave out the first loan, it almost took us 2.5-3 months, because we need to, the financial literacy training, actually, what we had to impart across to them was quite a thing, because today's scenario, it may sound little thing. Once we set up a branch, for us to scale it up to a clientele of 600, we do it in another 2-3 months. But in this case, the progress was very slow. But one thing which it satisfied us more is because these people they didn't even have bank accounts. They didn't have, so at that point of time, we had to do cash dispersal, and we got them actually introduced to financial services products, which they were absolutely didn't have any access to. They were, I mean, this is one of the things which I can remember of where we had gotten a service which was normally not offered to some clientele.
Thank you for the example. I will, okay, so then in terms of just a couple of other elements in the demand side story, right? We're talking of the interface between customer and the provider. And here I think there are two dimensions that are at play. One is around trust, and the other is around sort of biases that affect behaviors. So just coming to trust, I think kind of mistrust of formal financial services is something that the Tarun Ramadore committee had specifically mentioned. So what would it take, for FSPs to kind of crack this trust deficit with new customers and products that they are unfamiliar with? And I want to ask this question to Rajiv. And we are not saying unfamiliarity because they don't think it's right for them. It's just that they simply didn't know that such products or solutions existed, and they simply didn't know that these are actually useful. So in a context where we have the right product, there is still something holding. So what can we do to kind of crack that trust barrier?
So I would say it has been a long journey, but overall, as an industry, the microfinance industry has established a very good reputation with its customers, and the trust coefficient, I think, has been very nicely established. And this is when the institution is giving money. Mm-hmm. So I think we are writing a framework where we are not unknown to the most of our customers. We have a relationship where we are giving the money first, and we are trusting them, as you rightly said earlier. So I think that base of a relationship already exists. All our rural customers as of today are typically starting with a microfinance relationship with us, which is the first fulcrum of the trust factor. The fact that we do doorstep banking is another element of trust, because they don't have to come to us. So it's not like, oh, you know what, we are here to take some money from you and put in the savings account, and then you need to come to us. We are servicing you at your doorstep. So there the convenience factor is understood, and the fact that our employee will go and meet them every month, that is seen. Third, I would say, is a big element of technology, that if you can demonstrate a system which is instantaneous and responsive. So when you do an action, if a customer gets a reaction, so let's say when we disburse into the account, the customer gets an SMS, so much money has been credited into your account. When people pay their installments, an SMS goes back. Now, these are all benefits of a newer technology. They were not there in the earlier world. So now an SMS goes back to the customer saying you got credit. So OTPs, when you do special transactions, the OTPs go to the customers. So now the bank is talking to them. The more you can demonstrate technology, the debit card, and the stability of the debit card, that they use it and it works. And it is not a piece of plastic which generally doesn't work and works less and doesn't work more. It is a stable solution. UPI solutions, a lot of our, I would say about 10% of our customers do make UPI transactions on bank accounts. It's surprising, but they're active. And when the UPI system uptimes are good, so technology, a stable technology is a good way of building trust. When you do a transaction, if it does not work, you lose trust with the institution. So I think the technology interface has been very useful in building this trust. After that, it's the word bank. It's a certification by the regulator and the government. So that helps. So I would say all these elements together, starting from microfinance to the doorstep service, to technology, to the brand of the bank, and all the regulatory compliances around it. These are the elements which have helped us. And it's more difficult to build trust in an urban world where there are more universal banks there. You're a new bank. People have seen the fiascos of the cooperative banks, of Yes Bank, and other challenges that existed out there. And therefore, people were more tentative in the initial launch of the bank. But I would say in the financial inclusion world, where we do so much business, the trust is already established. We are building further on it.
Wonderful. Thanks for that. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about trust, and here is the more difficult angle, which is behavioral biases, right? And there's a lot of research around this, not specifically in India, but there's and behavioral econ research is subjected to this question of replicability, extra. So I mean, there's a whole bunch of issues there, and there are reasons why those issues exist. But I think at the interface with the provider, I think these factors, so behavioral factors, play a very important role in determining take-up and sort of continued usage, right? So, for example, patience and self-control are strong predictors of savings. There's a lot of research that shows that people who pay attention, or if you can get people to pay attention and to maintain discipline, then you can attain the goal of sort of better participation, better particularly savings. So commitment savings devices are one such example, where you have a goal and then where the goal is in fact fairly visual and very to you, and then you kind of save against that. And then there are some of these other sort of concepts that we as researchers have heard quite a bit, which is like hyperbolic discounting, where people would tend to value an immediate gain over sort of a much larger future gain, or even loss aversion, which is that I would rather prevent occurrence of loss today. So can I avoid that loss rather than sort of would I trade that off for a future gain, right? Like so I think there are a lot of these kind of studies and issues that we are seeing. I want to, and so notwithstanding the terminology, right? I want to bring in Vishakha to this. To ask, and in fact, I want to ask both Vishakha and Bhavesh the same question. How important is this in your experience? Are there any examples that you would kind of like to share where a slight tweak in the way in which you interact with the customer has resulted in better uptake and usage?
So I'll just go first, and Deepti, there's a point that Mr. Yadav made, which said that people don't deposit money, and we're simply talking about bank accounts, right? And I would like to believe that most people are pretty, here and now people, and the amount of advertising that's been there in terms of consumerism, the amount of increase that instant rewards, instant gratification has happened. It takes a lot of discipline and ability to plan for the future. Even if I go back and look at whether it's PF or it's PPF or any of these long-term savings, most of them happen when there are guarantees, or when people have had a bad experience, or when there is enough of awareness which is built in and drummed in, and there is at least one risk-averse person in that family who is drumming it into the rest of them to really plan. What worked for us, honestly, in especially a place like the rural areas, when we sell through RRBs and CSC a lot of products in that area, right? Has been small chopals where we talk about risk and we talk about long-term savings. We talk about people having a retirement age, even if they're agriculturists, and say you will get old. You will not be able to go to the field, and so what are you going to do? One of the points that has come back to me, and you're a research-oriented organization, you will have better data. I have anecdotal data. Has been the government schemes that are getting used, and therefore people not feeling the need to do any long-term planning, because there is a very strong belief that is developing that they will get old age pension and that there will be government subsidies to look after them. It's a very anecdotal feedback that I get. And what has worked for us has been a lot of these chopals that we do, and a little bit of nukkad natak that is done. I think these are something that have helped in awareness. And again, there, the impact has got to be immediate. If something closes soon after that, nukkad natak is over, within the next 24 to 48 hours, the sales happen. Otherwise, insurance has been a very impulsive purchase. It has not been a thought through risk management based call, while that's what insurance really is. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, no, thanks, Vishakha. And I just had a comment to make, which is on, this is certainly an interesting angle, which is that do the effect of government schemes ultimately result in households not planning for some of these longer term commitments that they may have to put into place as of today? I suppose it's it's just a question for us when we go back to research questions that are emerging from these discussions. But the fact is that, government with the Atal Pension Yojana as well as the NPS has been trying to shift away from sort of fiscal spending on direct benefit schemes, rather to move towards a direct contribution scheme, right? And so I think that's not very much playing out in the real world because of a lot of these schemes that are announced. So that's an interesting question we're going to take back. Bhavesh, over to you again. The same question: what's the impact of behavioral biases and other examples that you want to share in this regard?
Sure. So I'll take a slightly different example than saving more on the credit side and the overall ecosystem around behavioral biases being overcome. So one classic example is the whole telecom penetration, both in terms of data, voice, as well as the handset sort of evolution. And there is a huge financial, I would say, financial product adoption, which has happened in this industry, which one needs to sort of go deeper into. To give you an example, in my own village in Rajasthan, I won't get a medicine there. Most of the medicines won't be available. But if I have to walk into any small nukkad shop, one can actually buy a mobile phone, get a SIM card, and get that mobile phone financed actually over an EMI. Now, if that same unorganized consumer or borrower, if he had to walk into a established bank branch, he would have a resistance saying that I'm entering into an air-conditioned branch of a bank. Will I get a loan? I don't have documentation. I don't have proper KYC details, or I don't have the confidence to walk into that bank branch and get a loan. That same consumer actually walks into a normal general store, gets the mobile, gets the SIM card, and gets that latest handset financed by a bank or an NBFC. And that's one good example of in terms of overcoming behavioral biases. Now, there are multiple players as part of the whole ecosystem which has bought in. The telecom service provider, the handset provider, as well as the bank or the NBFC, so financial service provider. And obviously, in a lot of instances, there is an insurance aspect also built in, where either the handset is financed or there is an opportunity to cross-sell some other insurance product. This is a very good example of saying that all behavioral biases have been overcome across different industries, and the consumer is very comfortable. Now, what does that? It becomes a feeder channel for multiple industries where the behavioral biases have been overcome. And specific to the financial industry, once the customer walks in, he may be largely a new to credit customer. But the financial industry, obviously, along with bureaus, have been able to solve for it. They are able to underwrite a new to credit customer and disburse that loan for taking that sort of handset within few minutes. Now, the point which Vishaka mentioned around instant gratification, that's what it does for the consumer. The lender is able to underwrite objectively, and the manufacturer is also able to sort of sell more. So that has obviously helped to bring the new to credit customer into the organized credit sector. And then once you have an established credit history, it gives a lot of comfort to the lender to cross-sell or provide more lending products or insurance product as well, because you have established a credit history, build credibility with the entire ecosystem. So this is one of the best example I wanted to share, which has overcome a lot of the behavioral biases, both for the consumer as well as for the service provider.
Yeah, Vishaka, you wanted to add to this?
Yeah, Dipti, I just wanted to come in for a minute and say, this is actually a brilliant way of looking at it, right? Where you've made it easier and easier for customers to get money, to get instant gratification. And an attempt that we made, like, you're aware of the Chota recharge that is made in all the prepaid subscribers, right? So you have a Chota recharge, which can be as low as 10 rupees. So we said, okay, let's add one more rupee to it, and we'll add one more rupee and we will just promote insurance. We will promote, because one more rupee on the Chota recharge will probably get you a PMJJBY policy, right? and
Yeah.
we couldn't do it, because the effort that is there when that chota recharge of 10 rupees, making that customer pay 11 instead of 10 is enormous effort. And that's the point probably Venkatesh made when he said that he's tying up for more creating of awareness. And that's just one point that I wanted to make as to why we will actually need the support of every single distributor, every single financial provider to actually start thinking about insurance as a risk management and risk mitigation tool. And not really look at instant gratification in terms of the reward, but go to the next level of education and making those efforts. So I think just couldn't help put that together to say how we really need to make that trade-off on effort versus reward and promote risk management. So just wanted to put that in.
Great. Bhavesh, do you want to respond to that, or?
I think so. Obviously, it's what you say, instant gratification more from a consumer point of view, and I'll add to it in terms of the convenience aspect. And create the convenience in such a way that the consumer don't feel intimidated of coming to an organized sector in terms of financial help or seeking financial products. And the example which I mentioned is saying that it's available at the Nukkad shop. That takes away a lot of biases which the consumer has. So that's one angle which we need to keep in mind when we look at sort of improving the adoption.
So I think Vishaka, point taken. Insurance as a, selling insurance is in fact super difficult. And like you say, perhaps there is, and I don't know how to kind of systematize it, right? But really, you're saying that all of these other actors in the ecosystem who are equally playing their role of increasing awareness until it becomes a mainstay in terms of people actually purchasing the product, even if convenience is already there up front. So that's actually a very kind of sobering note, but also something for us to keep in mind. I think we are fairly running out of time. I just had like this last question around the pandemic itself, right? And it's been a year since the lockdown began, and the effects of this have been devastating for household portfolios and their lives and livelihoods. There is sort of a lot of evidence that has been created over the year around which indicates that household incomes have been affected. There has been an increase in informal employment, and this means implications for household finances, access to and household finances not just around sort of saving but also spending, borrowing. And what does that mean? So when household finances are stretched in the form of in manifesting as depleted savings or high amounts of debt, reducing fallback options, these are bound to have long-term effects such as sort of nutritional, health, or educational deficits. Now that's the arena we're talking about, and within this, it's been a fairly a big shock for providers, to say the least. So, what is your? I think we'll start with Venkatesh. Would love to hear your thoughts, particularly because we are talking of the sort of microfinance has been serving that space. One could argue whether they're the most vulnerable or they're just about the most vulnerable in terms of consumers who are targeted. But in your opinion, is there any one structural change that has been brought about by the pandemic, which may in fact redefine, the way they're thinking about serving low-income households, or is it that it's actually made life a lot more difficult?
Yeah, if you look at COVID, wave 1 and wave 2 have been quite different in terms of how it spanned out. In wave 1, we saw they had double income, basically. As far as Samasta goes, we have close to around 80% in the rural portfolio, especially in some pockets of the country, especially north and east of the country. We had a lot of people having a double income, and since many of the male members in the household were outside, and they were able to support the repayments were much easier for the women household members. But as they came back, it actually shook them a little bit because they had to manage the repayments with one income source and all those things. But the second wave has come about in a very different way in terms of, in some cases, we had seen a little bit of more deaths in even in the rural pockets. That it's still we are not out of it completely. Where we are, as we talk, we are in midst of it. In some, given the population and vis-a-vis the impact, we are not seeing the proportion has been less, but definitely we are seeing their depletion now. In terms of the organization, we are seeing how we could support them with additional loans, or even if we support them with an additional loan, will they be able to go about repayment? So that's we are in midst of that discussion. And just to add on to it, definitely we have seen a little the digital collection mode of it has gone up a little bit. Given our penetration, people have the adaptability has been quite fast in terms of the digital thing, even at a rural space.
Okay, great. So it looks like digitization seems to be the big trend that we are seeing that has been accelerated. Rajiv, do you respond to this question?
So in our case, I think very similar thoughts to what Venkatesh said. I would say because we are also largely a rural-based institution, our customers' income was largely protected. We know that the agriculture sector as a whole had a growth when the whole other sectors were declining. Agri was still having growth, and that really helped. Also, our customers do things which are broadly in the nature of essential services. Either they are selling milk or they are doing some agri-allied activities. So again, their income was not badly impacted in that way. In COVID-2, obviously the disease has gone deeper, and therefore there is some degree of medical expenses would have come in, some degree of fatality. So those issues are there. But the good news in this wave is that it's been a rapid rise and a rapid fall versus the COVID one, which was an extended 6-month moratorium and slow recovery. A lot of us expect that a decent amount of stabilization will happen within 3 months at the ground level, both from a bank's perspective and from a customer's perspective. To Venkatesh's point, I think I would say digital collections, but I would say cashless collection. I think this COVID phase would direct this industry and give the customers the confidence to go into a cashless mode. Now, cashless can be through various means, but the hesitancy which we all had towards launching cashless options would gradually decline. And I think finally this will become a trigger of cashless collections, which will make both the disbursals cashless and then the collections cashless, which could be very good for the industry.
Okay, great. Bhavesh?
Yeah, just to add to what both Rajiv and Venkatesh mentioned in terms of the whole digital adoption has been the big takeaway of this, the positive side of the pandemic is that both the consumer as well as the players have all sort of migrated at a much faster pace on digital adoption, which is going to have multiple benefits. To go into deeper geographies, cater to low-income household segment digitally and in a very cost-effective way. It's going to work for all participants. And that's going to be the big advantage in terms of reducing the turnaround times, both in terms of acquisition as well as collection, reduce sort of operational inefficiencies, and bring down the cost significantly. And I'm sure this has made the mindset change both for the consumer and as well as the participants, is that you don't need a branch to seek a financial service, or you don't have to sort of have a physical presence. You can actually do all the financial transactions at the convenience of your home or your office. That's the big mindset change which has been brought about to the pandemic. And I think so all of us in the industry can leverage and build upon it at a very good pace in the next few quarters.
Okay, great. So there's a convergence here, but before I go to Vishakha, I had a question to Rajiv for the benefit of the audience itself. What's the distinction that you're making between digital and cashless?
Cashless will have to have a bank account at play. So what's the difference between digital and regular banking? Digital is when you start actually using your API based, your tab based solutions. So then you can call totally digital banking. Somebody transfers money by NEFT or RTGS into your account, it is definitely cashless, but it's not in the realm of things what we call digital banking. Digital banking has gone beyond using ATMs, and not coming to branches or doing NEFT, RTGS, IMPS, those kind of things. When there are applications used, either mobile applications or employee-based applications, the layer which is around core banking, which helps to do that, is called digital banking. So I would say when the customers move towards UPI, when the customers move towards APS solutions, then they adopt or wallets, then they are going towards digital banking and becoming cashless. When the customers transfer money from their accounts to the bank accounts, then it's more cashless, but not yet digital.
Got it. Yeah, but that's a very interesting distinction. Okay, Vishakha, last comments. What has pandemic done?
Pandemic has increased our claims ratio tremendously. Our ratios have increased by in excess of 30% in terms as compared to a non-pandemic period. And these are all on policies where pandemic was not priced for and we've not screened, right? Because I just took a data today for the conference. More than 82% of these increase in claims ratio are from policies which are more than 3 years old. So these are not policies on which we've priced it. These are not policies on which we have screened them for coming in. So existing customers are getting impacted. We've also seen a lot of pockets, Deepti, while you talk about micro segment or anywhere else industry is not doing well. Again, you have segments within micro across customers which are doing very well, right? The retailers, the pharmacies, the medical shops, the kirana shops. These are all who have been doing well. And all these people who are doing well have been a little more easy to nudge towards insurance. There has been a certain element of understanding of what a pandemic can do and wipe out. The reports that we are getting is of villages being wiped out, and I think that's the biggest tragedy of them all. Because wherever we have seen a certain amount of penetration, we never thought we'll have concentration of risk, but we're actually seeing concentration of risk, because if there's been one particular advisor or one particular CSC center who's been very active and has sold a lot of policies, and that village got affected, we actually seeing concentration of risk happening. So yes, the pandemic has impacted us directly. It is eating up into reserves, but as I said, that's the beauty of insurance. You haven't seen even one insurance company, and I speak for all life insurance companies here, who have refused to pay a claim because this was not priced for. And nobody went back and said, sorry, more than 3 years, we didn't even know we had to price for pandemic. And everybody's been honoring their promises. So I'm just hoping that this will actually go a long way in creating that awareness for long-term savings and insurance.
Wonderful. All right, so thank you so much for this wonderful panel. But it's not a time to go. We have about 6 minutes. I'm hoping to just go through some of the questions that we received from the audience. I'll probably sort of pick and choose a couple of them instead of going through them all. Some of it may have already been responded to in the comments, so please feel free to sort of reduce the time spent on a response as you go through it. So here's the question for Rajiv. So should we ask, the transition from being an MFI to a bank would also have a challenge of creating trust among customers, especially regarding deposits. How has the bank responded to this challenge? And do you observe any difference in this aspect when the SFB started versus now? Part of it has been responded to, but if there's any other elements that you want to add in there,
I think it's fairly responded to. Rural, there was no lack of trust. Urban, and given the environment where a lot of banks had serious issues and depositors were stopped from taking money, their own money, that caused a, I would say there are always concerns, and they will continue. But given 3 to 4 years of good track record, the larger name of small finance banks has got better brand established, not just one bank, but as a group of banks, there has been a better appreciation of that. So all the serious work which has been done, you get in a good set of bankers who already have relationship with some of those customers. So the process, the technology, the people, and the brand itself, the branch presence, as these things sort of increase, the trust gets built over time. And it's a journey. It's a continuous journey. It's never a perfect, point that we can say we have full trust.
Yeah. So I think there's one more question again to Rajiv. In the tribal areas, this is from Swati. In the tribal areas where mobile connectivity and KYC is in its initial stages, how does MFI approach them? Sorry, perhaps I would direct this to Venkatesh. How does the MFI approach them? Moreover, what is the advantage of profit for MFIs to work in tribal areas? Is it the supply-driven model in tribal areas?
I mean, just getting into the pocket at which we started working in, there was a decent amount of client base in terms of addressable audience. So, I mean, it was quite, I mean, definitely, yes, in terms of if it's a less number of audience, it makes it a little thing. This place was not too far away from our branch. It was only around 25 kilometers from our branch pocket, the tribal pocket, which we started working in. And yeah, it was quite challenging because at that point of time, we had to do offline KYC checks, and we started off in that way. And over a period of time, it has increased a little bit in terms of the telecom connectivity and all that things. So we started sometime in 2016, but now as 5 years hence, things have improved a little bit more.
Okay, so actually we have 2 more questions for Venkatesh. Again from Swati, maybe the financial dependence on informal sources for poor people and rural areas is the flexibility of funds used between different needs. So do MFIs give some sort of personal loans in rural areas? That's one question. The second, I think, again, is very important. How have the JLG loan repayments been digitized? And I think it's a very broad question, but maybe, and a lot of business practices that have been there, but maybe 1 or 2 things that you want to talk there will be good.
Yeah, with aspect to the, I mean, today when we start lending and for us, when we look at the loan utilization aspect of it, we are, I mean, what we go about looking at initially is if they have a proper income generation. If there's an income generation, we are comfortable in giving a loan. I mean, once we give a loan, we actually really don't know whether that loan is going into a consumption and proper thing. But what we see is the economic activity which has to be present when we give the loan. So over a period of time, when we get into an agreement for the second cycle of loan or something, definitely we see we would have seen the income generation increase, and therefore, so I mean, though we have in between, we do have top-up loans, emergency loans, and all these things, which are which we could say these are personal loans kind of a thing. Which, but I mean, we have given that loan based on some income generation activity, and there is a personal loan also attached to the main loan. In terms of the digital collection aspect of it, primarily we are looking at a more like a cash light model more than a thing. We do have UPI collections. We work on a BC point collection. So we have two options in that, where customer comes over to a BC point and deposits money, and we also have what do you say? We have our own feet on street depositing money into things. So I mean, I can say it's we call it the cash light model. We want the cash to be less traveled. So it's a combination of various things which we have approached in this way.
Okay, great.
We are also doing a little bit of AEPS also.
So Cashlight is interesting, and I have more questions, but maybe I'll take it offline on this, which is that how do you reduce or how do you optimize in such a way that the travel time is the least when it comes to movement of cash? which again is like a big last mile challenge, right? Just cash management. I see Rajesh smiling. Yes.
Yeah.
So we have a bunch of. So anyway, so I think we're short of time. But last question, I think. Sorry, not last question. We have, I think, one question to Vishakha and then one question to Bhavesh. Vishakha, your question is really around: can we also tie with nodal agencies who send? This is from Amar Bal. Can we also tie with nodal agencies who send subsidy to have an auto debit of insurance? So with money in hand, getting life and health insurance is good for the client, especially in the vulnerable section. And I think that's one question that that was posed. And Nikhil had a question around, if we were to do insurance still a push product, and if we reduce the premium to 100 rupees 100 and give flexibility to the customers to kind of add the insurance cover whenever they have money, will the customer go for life insurance by themselves? Yeah.
And the answer to the first question is yes. We're happy to tie up with any nodal agency to any deduction of premium, any API integration, any collection. We were even willing to go ahead and have a product with, as I said, the EMI collections of all the microfinance companies, where because they do have a system of collecting 100 rupees or whatever is the EMI, and we said we're willing to add 10 rupees premium to it and construct a product. So yes, we're willing to do a lot. I'm a very passionate believer of insurance. Spent 35 years, 87 onwards, I've been in insurance. So a huge believer of insurance as a product. So willing to do all of those. The 100 rupees we've tried, as again said, somewhere it will have to, distributors will have to make that little leap of faith and say, okay, little extra work, I don't get reward, but can I, if I tag it to something I'm already doing, is it okay to not measure effort versus reward? And, only measure the incremental effort and say, it's okay, it's a good thing to do. It's a good thing to do by the customer. So we'll need a little bit of an altruism, I think, because pricing at 100 rupees and being able to give a good deal to the distributor and the customer and protect the insurance company so that we don't go insolvent means everybody gets only a little bit, and we will need, as I said, we all have to come together as a community. I mean, there's so much good work being done by MFIs and small payments banks. I think we all need to come together as a community and do that next step of insurance and long-term savings also.
Great, thank you, Vishakha, for that honesty there around what's there in it, what's in it. Literally the razor-thin payments that are available for participating in this. So last question, Bhavesh, you mentioned a lot of kind of alternative data, right? EPF, GST. Question to you was, what are the sources of these alternative data? And I think embedded in that is the question of how does TransUnion CIBIL have access to those kinds of information? And this is a big question. But if you had like a snippet as an answer here.
Yes, so TransUnion CIBIL do have access to all that data, both consent-based, non-consent-based. From the, say, for example, the GST data, APIs are available, MCA data, some of the utility data where the state boards have digitized their records. So those alternate data sources are available through multiple data sources, and TransUnion CIBIL does have access to, and that can be combined with the regular credit data to give a better risk separation and different scorecards and models to lenders.
Okay, great. All right, so I think this brings us to a close of this panel. There's a lot of takeaways, and I'm not going to say what's better and what's more important and what's not, because I think there's material in this for all of us to take away. And I hope these deliberations for the audience has been truly food for thought. Researchers, for me personally, whenever I have had a chance to talk to practitioners and we have an honest conversation here, keeping low-income households at the center, I always come away energized and full of ideas that we need to explore further, policy questions that we need to explore further and take. And that's really what I do for a living here. But as researchers, I do hope we've all found these as fascinating as it has been for me, and that you can go away with a renewed sense of what the business level sort of imperatives are when it comes to serving low-income households. So a big thank you to all of the panelists. Thank you for kind of coming together, spending this time, sharing your thoughts, particularly for researchers. Thank you so much. Over to you, Bhavesh.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Deepti, for moderating this panel discussion, and also thanks to all the panelists for an engaging discussion. So let's move on to the final session of the day. I would like to invite Amrita Mitra, Senior Director, Solutions, Consumer and Commercial from TransUnion Sibyl, to talk on finance for the new to credit segment. Over to you, Amrita. Amrita, you're on mute. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the opportunity today. I'll just bring up the screen in terms of the quick presentation put together for today. I know we have a 30-minute slot, so I'll try to complete the presentation in around 20 odd minutes, post which happy to take all questions and have a as good as a discussion, if not better, as you were having with my colleague Bhavesh Jain in the panel discussion earlier. So to begin with, without losing a lot of time, I will not go into a lot of macro data, which today is available to all of you, and you see it on multiple portals and websites and hear it on the news, but to just size up and give some very exact numbers in terms of not mobile connectivity or not digital usage, but very basics of what do we see from the census data as of adult working population in India. And if we look at the entire TransUnion Sibyl database, where we host or we have access to the entire data of individual consumers, because today I'm talking focused on the individual in terms of these stats, who have ever taken credit. As of today, close to 220 million, to be very exact, individuals are either running a live loan or servicing an active credit card. So immediately the disparity of around 200 million who either are not servicing a live loan as of today and or have never availed of a trade line is the very simplistic sizing of the new to credit, or the emerging consumer segment, as we call it. Now, if this is the sizing that we see from a market, from an outside perspective, being on this side of the table and working with lenders, what we see in terms of the credit context of consumers, emerging consumers being given loans to, on the right-hand side, you will note a chart, which is basically the actual count, the volume of loan originations, which have happened, retail loan originations, which have happened since calendar year 2015 till end of calendar year 2020. Now, obviously, as the economy has grown, as consumption lending or consumption-driven focus has increased, you will note that the gray bar, which is basically loans to consumers who have previous credit, that is, have a bureau track record, that line has consistently been growing. The gray bar, which is basically lending to new to credit or the emerging consumers, has actually remained pretty flat. And more importantly, when crisis like the lockdown of last year hit us, the first segment to get impacted in terms of loan disbursals was very clearly this emerging consumer segment. As we go down into the next few slides, there is a play of a circular reference happening in here, which, and along with lack of tools, which is not lending or helping the lending community get the relevant confidence to go big on the emerging segment. Now, When I'm stating this fact, we have gone through a detailed study to understand each hypothesis in isolation and see if the hypothesis holds true or not. And what do we see as the problem statement in the segment? And finally, what do we think that we can help with as part of starting a revolution to be able to lend credit to those who need credit and enable cheaper access to credit? Abbreviations used in the rest of the slide: NTC refers to new to credit, existing to credit, ETC refer to consumers who have a previous track record of credit. The first hypothesis is that lack of existing data, which means there is lack of bureau data. There is no previous credit history that this consumer has. What do we see as demand coming from this customer segment, the new to credit customer segment, and what do we see as the supply of credit? I'll try to explain these graphs. I know the slide looks busy. So if you look at the left-hand side chart, the left-hand side chart compares the growth rate of the new to credit and the existing to credit borrowers. New to credit 15 versus 16, it's a 21% growth on applications for loans, applications made by new to credit consumers to banks and other NBFCs. Whereas a 38% growth is seen in the customer segment who are applying for loans with various banks and NBFCs, but have previous credit history. Now, as you would be aware that the 2015-2016 was actually when the retail lending market was actually coming out completely of the downturn the market experienced in 2008-9. So there is a base effect at play as well here, which is why 17 versus 16, you will see a 60% growth in the existing to customer segment. 2018, the ratios between existing to credit and new to credit are 50 and 40. 19 to 18 is 49 and 20. While the ratios do tend to go up and down, you will note there is an average of 20% growth in demand of loans coming from the new to credit segment. The right-hand side is actually a similar comparison, but of loans given, quantum, count of loans dispersed against this supply. And while obviously the growth rate is nowhere near to the supply, 2019, before the pandemic hit us, actually the growth rate in supply was negative to -3%. So point one, obviously those who are not applying and going to a traditional money lender, I will not have data to support it, which will actually add to the fact of existing demand in the market. And if supply on the right-hand side cannot address even the current demand, which is happening in the organized sector, imagine the latent demand sitting in the unorganized sector as well. So first and foremost, there is definitely a lag in terms of the demand coming through and the supply. And as the lack of data, as we will see, encumbers lenders from taking informed decisions, thereby impacting the entire cost system of acquiring these customers, processing or enabling access to loans for these customers, and obviously through the life cycle up to collections. Now, if this is what is the hypothesis one, getting into hypothesis two. So while we have seen that lack of data is causing the supply to get constrained across all loan products, point number two is, while some lending continues to happen, so some of the supply side continues to come through, are banks actually learning from whom they are lending to in the new to credit space and improving over time as compared to the segment which has thick repayment history, credit data. How do the performance pan out? So we have picked up for this presentation today, picked up the example of credit cards. The reason for credit cards was, as you would be aware, active credit cards in the market around 35 odd million to 40 odd million. Considering the population, working population of India, that penetration is definitely very low. So we picked up the credit card originations as the example for this study. So you will note that very clearly, lenders who continue to lend in this space to whatever amount that they are lending to, the risk or the learning from a risk perspective is not coming through. I'll explain the left-hand side chart. The left-hand side chart refers to very simple acquisition vintages, 30 plus in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 MOB. The months on book are on the x-axis. The 30 plus percentages are on the y-axis. Obviously, those with previous credit history who have been underwritten by banks basis depth of data, which is the blue line, have significantly lesser delinquencies as compared to the segment which is new to credit. And this is true for both the charts. Now, what's the difference between both charts? And this is where this becomes interesting. Private banks today, while focus a lot on population or lending or issuing credit cards to, for that matter, even personal loans to, consumers who need not have credit history, but necessarily have a savings account with the bank. Which means that the bank does have some data, some transaction level data, some check bounce related data. The banks have access to that data, as against some of the new age banks who do not have that much of richness in their savings account, which is the right-hand side chart, plus entities like an Amex, who not only have richness, they won't have a savings account base to basically cultivate as compared to an HDFC. So just to explain it very simply, left-hand side will have HDFC in the cohort. Right-hand side will have Amex, SBI card in the cohort who do not have a fallback savings account base to cultivate further. But irrespective of access to data or no access to data, banking data, I mean, you will note that consumers with previous credit history distinctly perform well than the new to credit customer segment. This has a very huge risk cost. Looking at metrics like this, a policy manager sitting in a bank, a policy manager sitting in SBI card will very simply say, this segment on the red line, this is not something that we are comfortable doing because investments are not reaping benefits. Risk cost is too high. That is the first and foremost segment you will cut down on as soon as you get into any kind of a crisis mode. So reiterating hypothesis 1, supply is less given the demand. Whatever supply comes in, risk cost is high. Given the risk cost, the banking community doesn't develop the confidence to actually cater to the supply coming in, which for the bank might still be a good decision from a short-term perspective. A long-term perspective and for the economy as a whole may not always be a good decision. So while this is the risk cost for a risk manager and a policy manager to worry about, how about I extend this hypothesis to the third question? What about the processing cost or the operational cost for an NTC versus a non-NTC? Am I able to manage the cost of funds equally for the NTC segment and the non-NTC segment? Optimize cost of acquisition. The way we have tried to answer this question, again, continuing with the card story, we have tried to bucket the time which lenders take to decision on a card in terms of when the loan application hits the bureau and when the card actually enters the LOS of the bank, confirming that the loan has been opened. This is the time gap that we are measuring in here. So I'll explain or walk down the left-hand side chart. What we are saying is, for the new to credit population, 36% of the population today is getting approved within the same day, which means that when the customer is coming in, logging in a request with the bank is firing a bureau report, finds that the customer is not found, bank checks at traditional savings account and or any other data available and approves the loan. Perfect. The moment you have more information, which is in the 300 to 900 bucket, the time being taken is comparatively higher. So where lenders are trying to optimize the processing cost and not walking down the path of relevant due diligence, and they're able to do so because the proportion of customers in this segment is less, risk cost is high. This is basically lending because we need to be able to cater to that segment in some shape or form. So I am not paying as much attention to optimize the entire processing journey for this base, because this slide or this processing speed is completely at odds with the risk cost we have seen earlier. So there is certainly a dichotomy that in terms of optimizing cost, what line are lenders actually taking, which is true for the right-hand side chart as well. The fourth hypothesis that, yes, considering the lack of information, considering there is a cost asymmetry and a processing asymmetry in the new to credit versus the non-new to credit space, what is also very clear is that while the new to credit segment approvals are much lesser, approval rates are much lesser, risk cost is much higher, the approvals happen without the depth of due diligence, the line assigned to the consumer is obviously much lesser than the line assigned to a consumer with depth of data and previous credit history. If I connect those four blocks together, cards issued are lesser, risk cost is higher. The way that the risk cost banks are trying to manage is by taking much less exposure, assigning much lesser lines, and with the volumes being much lesser, the entire end-to-end seamless onboarding, giving an awesome experience to the customer, seems to be at odds with this. Connecting these four into four primary elements. First question, there is a product alignment. Now, this is where a lot of the information and data that we read on internet, the rise of the middle class in India, the rise of the entire fintech segment who is lending to an 18-year-old and a 19-year-old for 5,000 rupees or 2,500 rupees to fund their cafeteria costs, to fund mobile phones. That is the new emerging NTC segment today, as compared to the traditional first-time two-wheeler segment coming into the space or the first-time salaried customer going for the first credit card. So one, do we as a community have the right product aligned to the new to credit segment? Do we have the cost equation aligned to this segment in terms of, as I said, the risk cost, the processing cost? And cost alignment can never come unless things happen at scale. Scale drives cost. Retail lending runs as a tiger, disbursing close to 10 million consumer durables a month. The reason NBFCs on the consumer durable space are able to meet their majority of the consumer durable lenders are NBFCs, the cost of funds game gets played because they're running at scale and able to meet the cost requirements. The time alignment. From a timeliness perspective, are we able to reach out to the consumer to give the right loan at the right time, giving him the right experience? And finally, the most fundamental of it all, is there information symmetry? Or rather information asymmetry as compared to what we have in the non-new to credit space or the existing to credit space. What the bank decisions on, their policies, are obviously different bank to bank, lender to lender. But the knowledge that there is one loan that this consumer is servicing, he or she has had stress through the pandemic, we as a bank, whether we want to take a restructuring call, whether we want to lend, there is information available for the bank to take the call as compared to the new to credit segment where credit information is not available. And I'm highlighting on the fact of credit information not being available, connecting to actually the last question which Bhavesh was asked on a lot of alternate data stuff. So that is why this becomes very important, because till now, slides that I've put together over here align to credit data. Now, does this new to credit customer not pay his or her utility bills? Do they not pay his or her telephone bills? Must be. But that is where the catch comes in. And this information, while as Bhavesh rightly said, TransUnion CIBIL does work with providers of this data in terms of all the API connectivity and building products in conjunction to credit data. The data is also available to banks. GSTN data is available to banks. Utility data, the APIs are available to banks directly, but yet the banks have not necessarily been able to make a breakthrough in the new to credit segment using all of this alternate data. Because basis the data we have seen, you're not being able to ramp up volumes and extend credit and genuinely financially include those who are not included today. So just getting into, reiterating these hypotheses and aligning these hypotheses to the problem statements, as I call it, we've tried to stitch all of this together. And problem statement number one, let us start with that in terms of the alternate data. Today, to be using telecom data to underwrite a consumer, there is a genuine requirement of explicit consent. There is a requirement for banks to set up the entire consent architecture framework, capture consent, store the information for the relevant time period. There are questions, discussions going on about the DEPA framework, the Privacy Act coming into question, whether this data will be publicly available, not available. There are a lot of gray areas in the entire structure around consent to not consent. So does that mean that in the absence of credit data, in the absence of a consent to alternate data, will the banking community or the lending community not be able to gain confidence to lend to this segment? When I say confidence, the question is, even if the lending community is lending to a risky customer, it is a known risk which the lending community is taking, provisioning for it, accounting for it. So it is not necessarily a approve, reject decision or a go, no go decision, but taking an informed decision. Now, while this debate was ongoing, the other piece is note that usage of credit data for assessment of credit does not fall under the consent framework. The right to be forgotten doesn't fall for credit underwriting because that would allow delinquent and NPA customers to wreak havoc. So what does this mean? So this means that can I, as a bureau, as TransUnion Civil, help connect the dots and provide a basic foundation to banks, obviously look at very superior analytical tools, machine-based learning models to see that can I actually give a basic framework to banks to underwrite a model which holds, a model which may not be absolutely optimal, but forms a good enough framework. So a quick view into the logic. And I know a lot of questions might be forthcoming. Today, I do not have information about Amrita Mitra as an individual. Very basic definition of a new to credit consumer. But I can formulate multiple segments given my data of around 1,000 million trade lines, 500 million consumers who have ever taken credit, 200 million who are servicing a live loan today, down to a PIN code, down to a latitude, longitude level, down to an age bucket, down to the loan type that they are giving. If I start combining and creating cohorts for this consumer segment, I will translate to more than 4.5 lakh micro segments. So yes, I cannot identify Amrita Mitra, but I can identify the cohort where consumers similar to Amrita Mitra reside. Applying machine learning models and rules on top of that, this basically creates the entire credit framework, and I'll quickly read through this. Look at the 102, 105 on the x-axis on the left-hand side. 9.1% of all credit applications fall in the 102 to 105 bucket, credit applications. The blue bar is credit approvals. In 2018 and first half of 19. And what you see as the black line is the actual performance of this customer segment. If you go to the extreme right-hand corner, you will note that the 185 to 200 has a bad rate, actual bad rate of 1.7%. The bar graphs are the population distributions of those who are applying for credit, those who have been granted credit. The line graph is the actual 90+ rate that these originations, consumers who have been given loans, have shown. So my question therefore becomes, could the bank have rejected the blue bar in the 102 and 105 segment and actually approved the entire segment on the 185 to 200? So one, is there an opportunity to optimize risk and therefore the risk cost? Is there an opportunity to lend credit to those who need it without impacting the risk nuances of the bank or the bank's balance sheet? Yes, there is. Is this the most optimal framework? Can't this be made better? It definitely can be made better. But note that this credit underwriting module doesn't need consent. Now, if a consumer is willing to give consent, perfect. So which brings us to refer the left-hand side table. The right-hand side is the credit score. And what you see on the top is scores built out of telco and utility data.
Amrita, sorry to interrupt. We can, we just have one more minute.
Yeah, so this is the last of the slide. And,
great.
So therefore wanted to, just connect all the dots that yes, There is definitely demand in this space. Today, are we as a lending community able to do justice to the demand? Does not look like. Is there an opportunity to optimize processing and risk cost better? Definitely yes. From a credit solution perspective, is there a solution available in the market? Yes. Can it be made better? Definitely yes. By combining the credit foundation to a lot of the alternate data coming together. This is what I had for today. Thank you so much. Questions, please.
Thank you so much, Amrita. I'll quickly go on to the question. So we have one question. Do you know if the same trend hold true with regard to microfinance customers? That is, does the potential new to credit microfinance customer get a loan in less than a day? Could be great if you can share some insights on microfinance customers.
Yeah. So on microfinance customers, primarily the risk trend continues to hold the same. From a demand and supply perspective, yes, that trend does not hold true from an MFI customer. From a timeliness perspective as well. So of the 4 hypotheses, the first hypothesis doesn't hold good for MFI customers. We have not seen that big a gap in terms of demand or supply. But both in terms of the processing time, or the TAT as we loosely call it, and the risk, there is definitely a gap and an optimization which can be brought in. And happy to separately touch base with you and share the trends with you.
Sure. Thank you so much, Amrita. In interest of time, we will be wrapping up the session now.
Sure.
And great, excellent presentation. Thank you so much for your time. With that, I would like to close today's event. Thank you so much for everyone joining today. We look forward to your participation in upcoming day 4 and day 5 of the conference, which is tomorrow and day after. Please visit the agenda page of the conference website to know more about the upcoming sessions. Thank you.